Chapter 2541, Blade Reshaping, 5 hours. Shi Feng's expression darkened when he read the system announcement. While 5 hours wasn't exactly a short time, it wasn't particularly long either. It might be enough time if he were recasting an ordinary weapon, but he had to recast a potential legendary weapon. Furthermore, if the completion rate wasn't high enough, the weapon's attributes could be severely affected. He might end up turning a peerless weapon into just another top-tier weapon. With the 5 hours the system had provided, he only had a very limited number of times he could attempt the recast, as well. Recasting weapons in God's domain wasn't as complicated as creating one from scratch. Players only needed to reshape and refine the weapon. However, Shi Feng didn't have a design to work with, so he would have to determine the new weapon structure on his own. To make matters worse, he didn't know what materials the fragments had been forged with, which made it nearly impossible to take advantage of those materials' benefits. He'd have to work by trial and error, and achieving an ideal result would still be a major challenge. It seems I'll have to base the recast on the Abyssal blade for now. Glancing at the system timer, Shi Feng took a deep breath and activated the Philosopher's Hand, temporarily boosting himself to Advanced Master Forger. He then began to reshape the tattered blade into that of the Abyssal blade. Any other player would find this task to be a nightmare and a disaster, but Shi Feng, who had played God's domain for more than a decade now, was a different story. Although he had never touched upon the forging arts during his previous life, he was knowledgeable about them. He had spent time chatting with many master forgers about how to best recast a weapon in his past. Once mainstream players had reached level 120, recasting weapons had become a common matter for the various players. Many level 120+ dark gold weapons had been recast from epic weapons fragments, and once players collected all of the necessary fragments, they could recast them into an epic weapon once more. This had become one of the main sources of epic weapons for independent players. After innumerable recasts, players had discovered that one of the best ways to recast a weapon was to reshape it into one of the weapon fragment forms when they didn't know the original weapon's structure. The weapon fragment's previous forms had been made with the involved materials in mind. Hence, it was highly likely that fragments had taken a form quite similar to that of the original weapon. All players needed to do was make some minor adjustments to the new weapon structure. Shi Feng wasn't familiar with cruel darkness, so reforming the weapon in its form was out of the question. Fortunately, he was quite familiar with the Abyssal blade, a weapon he had obtained not long after rejoining God's domain. In fact, he was more familiar with its form than his other weapons. Shi Feng spent around 30 minutes reshaping the rough blade into something that highly resembled the Abyssal blade, although this new weapon had a considerably longer blade. It couldn't even be considered a one-handed sword anymore, but a two-handed sword. Appraise. Shi Feng began the appraisal, satisfied with his work, and as he did, the magic arrays covering the weapon activated, drinking in the ambient mana like a beast in the desert. The mana density around the long blade steadily rose. Shi Feng watched, excitement blooming in his chest. He hadn't actually thought his first attempt would be a success. With this, making adjustments to the weapon would be much easier. However, not long after that thought, the system reported the appraisal results, and he wasn't sure whether he should laugh or cry when he saw them. System, weapon completion rate 40%. Do you wish to keep this outer shape? Even with only a 40% completion rate, the new Abyssal blade could gather so much mana around it, and its aura had become incredibly powerful. He didn't even dare imagine how powerful the sword would be if he reached a 70% or higher completion rate. However, this new weapon's exterior was already ideal, and his results would be limited if he tried to modify it. Could the original be a two-handed weapon like Cruel Darkness? Shi Feng felt another headache brew as he considered the thought. Although he could recast the weapon into a one- or two-handed sword, recasting a one-handed weapon would be considerably more difficult if the original had been a two-handed weapon. While swordsmen could use two-handed swords, Shi Feng wasn't as familiar with that fighting style. Suddenly switching to a two-handed sword would severely impact his combat power. Yet, if he forcefully recast a two-handed weapon into a one-handed sword, he'd be abandoning some of the original materials. One-handed weapons required far fewer materials, after all. However, doing so would affect the weapon's completion rate. With fewer materials, the weapon wouldn't be as powerful as it once had been, and depending on the materials he abandoned, the weapon's composition could be at risk, causing disharmony between the materials. He'd have to take all of these factors into account when recasting this weapon into a one-handed sword. Normally, only experienced Grandmaster forgers could accomplish such feats. Not only did they have abundant experience, but they also possessed advanced skills that allowed them to discern the golden ratio among their materials. This was why Grandmaster forgers could craft legendary items. After giving the matter some thought, Shifeng decided to conduct some experiments. He initially sacrificed 10% of the weapon's materials, but it left too few remaining, and the ratio was uncoordinated. The result was only a 23% completion rate, and the weapon was far weaker than the first recast. He had then sacrificed 20% of the materials, which was, again, too much, and as a result, the sword lacked strength. This time, the completion rate was a measly 16%. Shifeng attempted the recasting 8 more times. Although each reshaping attempt took less time, he never earned more than a 60% completion rate. Even his best attempt had stopped at 58%, a long way from the required 70% completion rate. As he continued to reshape the weapon, time flew by. He paused when he had little over an hour remaining of the 5-hour time limit. Factoring in the time he'd need to refine the weapon, he didn't have much left for reshaping attempts. Do I really have to give up on recasting a one-handed sword? Shifeng's mind was a jumble when he realized how little time remained. If he continued to aim for a one-handed sword, he wasn't likely to succeed in the time he had left. Ultimately, his recast would fail, and he'd have to search for more legendary materials to try again. Unfortunately, collecting a set of legendary materials with Zero Wing's current strength was a fool's dream. By the time Zero Wing managed to find them all, he would likely have found another weapon to suit him. However, even a high-quality two-handed sword would be useless to him, and he wouldn't likely have a chance to recast the final product into a one-handed sword again. He had only found a fragment of the Abyssal blade by chance. Who knew when he would come across another? Damn it! Abandoning 17% isn't enough, but 18% is too much. I don't have enough time for more precise experiments either. Shifeng could not help but hesitate as he watched time slip away. After multiple experiments, Shifeng was certain that the golden ratio lay between 17% and 18%. He estimated that he'd need another 5 or 6 attempts to find the true golden ratio, but with only 1 hour left, he had time for, at most, 2 more reshaping attempts. It wouldn't be long before he'd have to refine the weapon. If he waited, the final product would be garbage, even if he reached a sufficient completion rate. I have no choice but to gamble, Shifeng thought, gritting his teeth. He then retrieved the ice dragon's claw he had obtained from the ice dragon Heathweight and refined it. Read latest chapters at Wuxia EU. The ice dragon's claw was a legendary material, and Heathweight had only dropped 2. He had already used 1 to summon the silver dragon in the Starlight Fortress, which only left him with 1. He had been saving it to forge a customized epic weapon for one of his guildmates. Doing so would be quite easy, even without an epic weapon design, and if he had a design, he could forge a fragmented legendary weapon with the ice dragon's claw. Since he couldn't verify the material's golden ratio, abandoning too many materials for the final product would be too complicated. Hence, he had no choice but to make up for the gap with the ice dragon's claw. It took Shifeng 10 minutes to refine the claw, transforming it into a dark blue crystal. He merged the crystal with the abyssal blade, which added a white glow and a bone-chilling aura to the new weapon. Once the dark blue crystal had completely merged with the abyssal blade, Shifeng appraised the sword. Please succeed. Shifeng silently prayed as he watched the system appraise the reshaped abyssal blade. Chapter 2542, New Abyssal Blade. As the system began to appraise the weapon, the magic arrays on the new abyssal blade simultaneously lit up. Not only did these arrays illuminate the entire room, but they also gathered the room's mana around the weapon. The abyssal blade emitted another deafening dragon roar that echoed throughout the room. Roar! It was so powerful that Shifeng stumbled away from the weapon, and the magic arrays around the room's walls brightened, creating an additional barrier. Boom! The roar shook the dual-layered barrier violently, and it seemed as if the barrier would shatter at any second. As the roar faded, peace returned to the room. Following which, a chill swept through the room, and even Shifeng, who had very high magic resistance, shuddered in the cold air. He felt as if he were standing in an icy tundra, and he could feel his body begin to freeze. What powerful mana! When Shifeng looked back at the new Abyssal blade, the origin of the chill, he could sense that it was only an effect of the weapon's magic arrays triggering. If even the automatically triggered arrays produced such a result, they'd reach a whole new level of power under his control. Before he could get a better feel of the new weapon's power, however, the arrays suddenly went dormant, and the room quickly returned to normal. System, weapon completion rate 86%. Do you wish to keep this outer shape? 86%. Shifeng stared at the system notification in astonishment. He hadn't actually believed that his gamble would pay off, and in spades, at that. The resulting completion rate was 16% higher than the base requirement, which completely exceeded his expectations. Once a weapon's completion rate reached the standard in God's domain, a higher percentage would yield hardly any bonuses to the displayed attributes. Rather, it would improve the weapon's hidden effects. Naturally, the higher the completion rate, the stronger the hidden effects would become. An 86% completion rate was by no means a low value. Less than 10% of God's domain's weapons had an 80% or higher completion rate, with most hovering around the 75% threshold. Only 1% of all weapons in the game had an 85% or higher completion rate. And according to Shifeng's knowledge, the highest completion rate ever achieved when crafting a weapon was 94%. He had heard that the epic weapon's performance even rivaled a fragmented legendary weapon. Shifeng didn't even dare to dream of forging a weapon with a 90% completion rate. Only Grandmaster Forgers were capable of such a feat. He was merely an intermediate Master Forger and had only reached Advanced Master rank due to the Philosopher's Hand. He had never expected to achieve an 86% completion rate. He immediately chose to keep this shape, and as he confirmed his decision, the new Abyssal blade gently landed on the central platform. Amazing! So, this is the power of the merged fragments? Surprise flashed in Shifeng's eyes as he took up the new Abyssal blade. The old and new Abyssal blades looked roughly the same on the outside, but the new weapon was much heavier than the old one. However, despite the increased weight, Shifeng felt far more compatible with this weapon than he ever had with the hilt in his hand. It felt as if the sword were an extension of his body. He could even feel the ambient mana flow through the weapon. With the new Abyssal blade in his hand, his mana sensitivity underwent a qualitative transformation. He wasn't a magical class player, and his mana sensitivity couldn't compare to theirs. Mana sensitivity might not be particularly useful for physical players, but it was useful to experts, especially those who were adept at manipulating magic arrays. Not only could players control magic arrays far more easily with greater mana sensitivity, but they could also locate arrays' weak points with less effort. Moreover, once one's mana sensitivity reached a certain level, players could shatter their opponent's skill or spell by manipulating the flow of mana in the air. They could even prevent opponents from using skills or spells at all. System, you have 30 minutes remaining. Please complete the recasting process as soon as possible. If the process fails, the weapon will disintegrate. Too close. I nearly ran out of time. Shifeng breathed a sigh of relief when he heard the system notification, and he started to refine the new weapon. The refining process was much simpler than the reshaping process. He merely needed to add the blade's edge and polish the sword's magic arrays. As both an intermediate master magician and a temporary advanced master forger, these were simple tasks for him. He completed the process in less than 20 minutes. The instant Shifeng finished the new weapon, he heard the sound of another system notification. System, weapon recasting successful. Please name your new weapon. Abyssal blade, Shifeng replied without hesitation. System, naming successful. Recast weapon will be named the Abyssal blade. Do you wish to activate auto appraisal? Appraise. Shi Feng answered. Letting the system appraise the weapon might not mean much to ordinary players, but to Shi Feng, a master forger, it was a relatively useful tool that would grant him some forging proficiency. In fact, master forgers during his previous life had sometimes taken recasting commissions for free to gain more forging proficiency. As long as they were successful, the forger responsible would be awarded an abundance of proficiency. A master forger might save 1 or 2 days of work with one successfully recast weapon. System: appraisal of the Abyssal blade is complete. Weapon completion rate is at 86%. Weapon rank is designated as Fragmented Legendary. Rewarding 30,000 forging proficiency. The notification stunned Shi Feng. Wonderful. It's upgraded to Fragmented Legendary rank. Shi Feng looked at his new weapon, ecstatic. Although he had guessed that there was a high possibility of the end product reaching Fragmented Legendary rank, he couldn't help his joy after hearing his guess verified. A Fragmented Legendary weapon. He had quite a few Fragmented Legendary items on him, but none were weapons, they were only equipment pieces and accessories. The increased combat power they could provide was nowhere near that of a Fragmented Legendary weapon, and although he had been thinking of hunting one down for himself, acquiring such a weapon was easier said than done. Furthermore, he would have to find a compatible one-handed sword. Now that he finally had a Fragmented Legendary weapon that suited him perfectly, why wouldn't he be excited? Shi Feng immediately called up the Abyssal Blade's attribute panel. Normally, recasting a weapon significantly changed the weapon's attributes. The new weapon would no longer be what it once had been. Abyssal Blade, one-handed sword, magic weapon, Fragmented Legendary rank, equipment requirement, strength 3000, agility 2000, attack power, 210% of strength attribute, attack speed, 2% of agility attribute, all attributes, increases according to user's level, ignore levels plus 35 attacks have 70% chance to cause 250% damage, 40% chance to cause 300% damage, every attack increases damage by 2% to a maximum of 30%. When equipped, strength increased by 50%, agility increased by 50%, intelligence increased by 35%, endurance increased by 50%, attack speed increased by 50%, all effects of weapon-related skills increased by 20%, all item level requirements reduced by 10 levels. If wielder belongs to a swordsman-related class, all skill levels plus 6. Increase free ability points received for every increase in level by 2 points. Equipment Tier 3. Can be evolved, devour 4 God Crystals to evolve to Tier 4. Additional active skill 1, Darkness Bind, Tier 3. Binds all enemies within a 100-yard radius for 3 seconds and reduces their defense and magic resistance by 100% for 15 seconds cooldown, 40 seconds. Additional active skill 2, Darkness Domain, Tier 3. Converts an area of 200 yards around the user into a darkness domain. Weakens the senses of all enemies within the darkness domain and reduces enemies' basic attributes by 15%. While inside the darkness domain, the user may control up to 36 strands of power of darkness. Each strand carries force equivalent to 110% of the user's strength and causes 100% darkness damage. Duration, 60 seconds cooldown, 8 minutes. Additional passive Profound Inheritance, Mana Abyss, Tier 3. The higher the density of the mana surrounding the Abyssal Blade, the more power the weapon will exhibit. Power of the weapon can be increased up to 100%. Additional active Profound Inheritance, Black Dragon's Soul, Tier 3. Grants the user the Black Dragon King's soul and transforms the user into the Black Dragon King. The higher the density of the surrounding mana, the higher the Black Dragon King's life rating will be. Can use the skill, Dragon Breath. Duration, 10 minutes cooldown, 12 hours. A sword recast from the fragments of an ancient, unknown weapon. The Black Dragon King's power has been sealed within the sword, although the Black Dragon King has cursed the weapon. Beyond the immense strength the blade offers, the wielder must face a backlash after a certain amount of time. If the wielder cannot suppress the backlash, the wielder will receive the Black Dragon King's curse, permanently reducing all attributes by 70%. Unable to be dropped. Unable to be traded. Unable to be destroyed. So strong. Not even Fire Dance's 1,000 transformations can compare to this. The new Abyssal Blade's attributes left Shifeng flabbergasted. With such attributes, doesn't this sword nearly rival legendary weapons? The new Abyssal Blade was like a combination of the old Abyssal Blade and Cruel Darkness. Even top-tier fragmented legendary weapons were likely weaker than the sword. When Shifeng wielded the Abyssal Blade, he felt that he could display Tier 4 power with a normal attack, even without using a mana technique. I had been worried about getting to Solomon's Sword's fragments in Poison City, but with this, that shouldn't be a problem. Poison City was a level 120 secret land, and although it might be a challenge, even with his new weapon and the Hell Legion's help, it was no longer impossible. Read latest chapters at Wuxia World. EUA Level 120 Secret Land. If Level 100 Team Dungeons were a place for players to adapt to Tier 3, Level 120 Secret Lands were treasure troves for Tier 3 experts. Within these secret lands, players could find ancient inheritances, including Tier 3 skill and spell books, as well as ancient potions that could help players unlock their mana body's potential. By the time Shadow had grown strong enough to raid level 120 secret lands during Shifeng's previous life, the various superpowers had long since swept through them, leaving only scraps for ordinary powers. If Zero Wing could start raiding level 120 secret lands now, the guild's ability to nurture Tier 3 players and help them unlock their mana body's potential would definitely surpass that of the various superpowers. His guild would become a true titan in God's domain. Now that my weapon is complete, it's time to meet with the players from the Dark World. Shifeng sheathed the new Abyssal Blade and left the underground core room. Chapter 2543, Determining Fate with Words. Stone Forest City, Zero Wing's residence. As Shifeng parted the doors to the guild hall's top-floor reception room, he felt two sharp auras locking onto him, which kept track of his every move. The two who radiated these auras definitely had domain realm combat standards. When Shifeng glanced into the room, he spotted three people. The two people that accompanied Gentle Snow were a man and a woman, both of whom radiated such dense darkness energy that it took on tangible form. Even players who normally couldn't sense darkness energy could see a layer of black fog around the two players. The woman looked like she was in her early 30s and was a rare Dark Knight class. She was also a member of the rarer Dark Wolfkin race. Her aura was only slightly weaker than Gentle Snow's, who wore a piece of fragmented legendary equipment. The elderly man beside her garbed himself in pitch-black robes and held a black staff. He had long, pointed ears and tainted the room's mana with an icy, dark aura. Ordinary Tier 2 magical class experts would find the mana here difficult to manipulate. A fallen half-elf? A hint of surprise flashed in Shifeng's eyes. Mana loved the elven race, and they were born with an extraordinary affinity for manipulating it. However, God's domain had a group of elves that had fallen to darkness in pursuit of mana's limits. They were known as fallen elves, and all natural elves relentlessly hunted them down. Fallen elves were unusual in God's domain, and players that successfully converted to the fallen half-elf race were even rarer. Of course, any superpower would target a fallen half-elf for recruitment. Fallen half-elves had an even stronger affinity for mana than ordinary half-elves, and their affinity for and control over the power of darkness was especially impressive. They could practically rival pure elves. Elves might not compare to dragons, but they were one of the top races in God's domain, with far greater growth potential than human players. By becoming a fallen half-elf, one would have the growth potential to rival true elves, and after Tier 3, each subsequent tier would grant a fallen half-elf a qualitative boost to their strength. Furthermore, any player that converted into a fallen half-elf proved they had very high combat standards. As long as they received enough resources, they were almost guaranteed to reach Tier 5. With the race's natural talents, no one would be able to take down a Tier 5 fallen half-elf player outside of Tier 6 God-ranked experts. As far as Shifeng could remember, players only had a chance of completing the trial to become a fallen half-elf after they had unlocked their mana body's full potential, yet this elderly guest of his hadn't and had still successfully converted. Allow me to introduce you, Guild Leader. These experts from two of the Dark World's top 3 guilds. They've come to discuss the issue of Demon's Heart with Zero Wing, Gentle Snow announced as Shifeng entered the room. The Dark World was incredibly vast, roughly as large as 3 ordinary empires. The other world was even larger than the Fire Dragon Empire, one of God's domain's 4 great empires. 3 guilds ruled over the Dark World: Dark Rhapsody, Deity Society, and World Domination. They had all received support from major corporations during the game's early stages and had secretly poached quite a few experts from the various super first-rate guilds and super guilds. Since then, these 3 guilds had been steadily developing their strength in the Dark World, and now, each could rival a super guild. Zero Wing's 2 current guests were representatives from Dark Rhapsody and Deity Society. Seeing that you've come without warning, I'm assuming you're in quite a rush. Please, just speak your mind, Shifeng addressed the 2 players before him. He had a rough understanding of Dark Rhapsody and Deity Society. Although they hadn't been powerful enough to rank as 2 of the 6 great dark guilds in the past, they had still been strong enough to rival super guilds. When the main continent and the Dark World had connected, the 2 guilds had each annihilated a superpower, using the victories as stepping stones to secure a foothold on the main continent. These 2 guilds' strength could not be underestimated. You are just as straightforward as the rumors say, Guild leader Black Flame, the female Dark Knight said, smiling. This trip hasn't been an easy one, so let's be forthright. Elder Gold and I are here on behalf of our respective guilds, and we hope to sign a contract with Zero Wing. A contract? Regarding what? Shifeng asked. I'm afraid you still don't realize how terrifying Demon's Heart can be, Guild leader Black Flame, particularly its vice guild leader, Flaming Light. He holds the key to activate the passage between the Dark World and the main continent. After the humiliation the guild suffered at your hands, he's almost guaranteed to use it in the Cold Spring Forest. All of the Dark World's players will swarm the area, and Stone Forest City isn't likely to survive the coming storm, the fallen half-elf, whom the female Dark Knight had referred to as Elder Gold, said. However, our guilds don't wish to serve as Flaming Light's hired thugs, and as such, we have come to negotiate with Zero Wing. That's right. The contract we have in mind is very simple. If the passage to the Dark World opens in Cold Spring Forest, our guilds will not take any action against Zero Wing or Stone Forest City, the female Dark Knight continued, chuckling. I'm sure this will alleviate a considerable amount of pressure your guild and city will face. How you depend on the rest of the Dark World's denizens will depend on you, Guild leader Black Flame. And what do you want in return? Shifeng asked. The 2 dark guilds' proposal didn't surprise Shifeng in the slightest. Demon's Heart might have some influence in the Dark World, but it was nothing compared to the other world's top 3 guilds. It was now obvious that Demon's Heart intended to use the Dark World as its spearhead, and some of the Dark World's players weren't happy about playing that role. They would have to expend their resources to fight the main continent's powers, yet only Demon's Heart would gain an advantage. Hence, Dark Rhapsody and Deity Society had come in search of a partnership with Zero Wing, which owned a guild city in Cold Spring Forest. It is nothing significant. We merely wish to discuss the allocation of Cold Spring Forest's resources, Guild leader Black Flame, Elder Gold said. Both of our guilds are large organizations, and we require an extraordinary amount of resources. In exchange for our neutrality, we'd like half of Cold Spring Forest's resource areas. We will not interfere in any matters in the other half. Naturally, we would like Zero Wing to agree to the same. Call it a non-interference pact. Gentle Snow couldn't help but frown from beside Shifeng. At first glance, the conditions Elder Gold had stated were generous. Cold Spring Forest was an abundant resource map, after all, and not even Zero Wing could monopolize it. However, if Zero Wing signed this contract, the guild wouldn't have to battle the rest of the Dark World's powers and players for the remaining half of the map. This would undoubtedly intensify the competition. In contrast, Dark Rhapsody and Deity Society could avoid a fight with Zero Wing, their largest competitor in the Cold Spring Forest. I see, Shifeng said, nodding. This proposal will benefit each of our 3 guilds. May I know your thoughts on this, Guild Leader Black Flame?" the Dark Knight asked. "Since your two guilds are so sincere, how about this? Zero Wing will concede 70% of Cold Spring Forest's resource spots. In exchange, your guilds will offer us some other resources. We don't want much, 500,000 darkness crystals will do. What do you think?" Shifeng countered with a smile. Read latest chapters at Wuxia World. EU Guild Leader. Gentle Snow exclaimed, turning to Shifeng with wide, shocked eyes. Competing with the Dark World's various powers over half of the Cold Spring Forest's resources would already be an immense challenge. If they only had 30% to fight over, the Dark World's powers would immediately declare an all-out war against their guild. Shifeng's counteroffer even confused the female Dark Knight and Elder Gold, not to mention Gentle Snow. They had considered the possibility that their offer would be rejected before they had visited Zero Wing's residence, or that Zero Wing would try to minimize the amount of resources it would share with their guilds. They had discussed various countermeasures for these possibilities. In fact, they had planned for several days of negotiation with the guild. However, they had never dreamed that Zero Wing would offer even more of Cold Spring Forest's resources. What, exactly, was this man thinking? Chapter 2544, Crazy Black Flame. The female Dark Knight and Elder Gold were both dazed for a long moment after hearing Shifeng's counteroffer, and they even wondered if he were joking with them. With their original offer, in which Dark Rhapsody and Deity Society claimed 50% of Cold Spring Forest's resource areas, the rest of the Dark World's powers would have to battle Zero Wing for the remaining half. Even if the Dark World's various powers tried to avoid it, they would come into conflict with Zero Wing. With so many players vying for such limited resources, a blood fight was inevitable. Unfortunately, the Dark World's powers couldn't afford to search for other level 100 neutral maps for their development. At least, it wasn't something they could afford before the Dark World's players had expanded their influence on the main continent. This was precisely why the various superpowers were so afraid of Demon's Heart's flaming light. And yet, Shifeng had just offered another 20% of Cold Spring Forest's resources. It was insane and suicidal. His counteroffer might seem wise to ordinary people, as doing so would allow Zero Wing to tighten its defensive line and secure better control over its resource areas, but Dark players would have no choice but to fight for those resources spots. None of the other world's players would dare go against Dark Rhapsody and Deity Society. If the two guilds controlled more of the Cold Spring Forest, even more Dark players would have to fight Zero Wing for resources. Zero Wing's very survival in the map would be in question, not to mention obtaining resources in Cold Spring Forest. Has he given up on Stone Forest City? It was the only possibility the female Dark Knight could think of. Zero Wing wasn't about to face one or two superpowers, but an entire otherworld. Moreover, it was an otherworld with even more players than the Fire Dragon Empire, and not a single power could stand against such a force. Realizing this, Shifeng must have decided to abandon Cold Spring Forest's resources in exchange for the Dark World's precious darkness crystals. It was a worthwhile transaction, but no normal person would accept such an exchange. Developing a guild city required a massive amount of time and resources. Not just anyone could afford to abandon an entire guild city without a second thought. Are you serious, Guild Leader Black Flame? Elder Gold asked. He could not think of a single reason to refuse Shifeng's offer. Although 500,000 darkness crystals were valuable, they were insignificant compared to 70% of Cold Spring Forest's resource areas. Of course. If you don't believe me, I'll sign the contract right now, Shifeng replied, chuckling. Excellent. I agree to your offer on behalf of Deity Society. Elder Gold exclaimed, excitement glowing in his eyes. Only a fool would refuse. Throughout Cold Spring Forest, only Zero Wing could pose a threat to Deity Society. The other powers were not worth mentioning. If Zero Wing were willing to part with an additional 20% of the map's resource spots, Deity Society wouldn't have to worry about managing more territory. What about Dark Rhapsody? Shifeng asked as he turned toward the female Dark Knight. On behalf of my guild, I have no issues with this arrangement either, the Dark Knight answered without hesitation. Although she didn't know what this swordsman was thinking, her superiors would strangle her once she returned if she refused. Once Elder Gold and the female Dark Knight had agreed, the three players signed the contract stipulating that Dark Rhapsody and Deity Society would occupy 70% of Cold Spring Forest's resource areas, while Zero Wing would occupy the remainder. None of the three guilds would interfere in each other's matters, and the two dark guilds would provide a total of 500,000 darkness crystals. With the negotiations complete, Elder Gold and the female Dark Knight promptly returned to the Dark World to notify their guilds of the good news. They immediately began to prepare the 500,000 darkness crystals Shifeng had demanded, as well. Once the portal connecting the Dark World to the main continent opened in Cold Spring Forest, Dark Rhapsody and Deity Society would hand the crystals over to Zero Wing. When the news hit Dark Rhapsody's and Deity Society's main headquarters, the two guilds' upper echelons were astonished. I had never expected Zero Wing to be so daring. It seems it's quite confident of safeguarding its 30% of the map. But, how can that be? Zero Wing must realize that it cannot stop the Dark World's advance, it must be aiming for the next best option. I suspect the guild's decisive nature is the reason it has achieved the success it enjoys today. Don't forget, Zero Wing's enemies aren't limited to those in the Dark World. Demon's Heart is still lurking, and Zero Wing must think this agreement will help it stand against the Dark Guild. Heated discussions erupted among the two guilds' upper echelons over their new contracts with Zero Wing. None of them had expected this outcome, but regardless, it was good news for both of their guilds. While Dark Rhapsodies and Deity Societies spoke of the matter, news quickly reached Demon's Heart. Black Flame is quite bold, Elder Heart. It seems he intends to give up Cold Spring Forest's resources and focus his forces on protecting Stone Forest City, a level 108, Tier 3 Demon Viscount Shield Warrior commented, grinning at Furious Heart. Shifeng had so arrogantly strutted through Demon City, and now, because of Flaming Light's single move, his guild was forced to part with 70% of its resource areas in Cold Spring Forest. It was a joyous outcome for Demon's Heart. Humph. Did he think he'd get off scot-free after provoking Demon's Heart? Furious Heart said, snorting. If he thinks he can protect Stone Forest City by handing over 70% of Cold Spring Forest's resource spots, he should think again. He simply doesn't know how futile his actions are. Vice Guild Leader Light has already reached an agreement with several superpowers. When the time comes, Demon's Heart and the various superpowers will attack Stone Forest City from both within and without. We'll tear the city asunder and ensure that Zero Wing never again has a place in Cold Spring Forest. Demon's Heart's other elders excitedly expressed their agreement. Zero Wing might assume its only opponents were from the Dark World, but in truth, the guild would have to face several superpowers, as well. Under their combined assault, Zero Wing would be as powerless as an ant. It had no chance of survival. Stone Forest City, Zero Wing's residence, while many superpowers gossiped about the agreement between Zero Wing, Dark Rhapsody, and Deity Society, Gentle Snow, confused, followed Shifeng to the guild warehouse on the residence's first underground floor. Guild leader, offering an additional 20% isn't worth just 500,000 darkness crystals. Cold Spring Forest's cold spring water is a huge help to Tier 2 players' development. It is the reason so many of our Tier 2 experts can work in level 100 neutral maps. Giving away so much of Cold Spring Forest will drastically reduce our Tier 2 members' development speed, Gentle Snow complained. She felt that Shifeng had gone too far this time. Even God's Domain's various superpowers fought like crazy over Cold Spring water, and due to its rarity, the competition was incredibly intense. Fortunately, with Stone Forest City, Zero Wing had an absolute advantage in the competition for cold spring water from Cold Spring Forest, and thus, no powers dared to cause trouble for the guild. This item allowed Zero Wing's Tier 2 members to level rapidly and reach level 105 far sooner than others. Once they reached that level and equipped level 105 top-tier equipment, these Tier 2 members could challenge their Tier 3 promotion quests, clearing them with relatively high success rates. As a result, Zero Wing continuously nurtured more Tier 3 players. If they gave away 70% of Cold Spring Forest's resource areas and had to compete with the Dark World's players over the remainder, Zero Wing would likely have to abandon Cold Spring Forest entirely. Meanwhile, darkness crystals were an attributed magic crystal, and while they were valuable, that was only true for dark players due to the darkness energy they contained. Darkness energy wasn't helpful to regular players in the least. In fact, to regular players, 500,000 darkness crystals weren't even worth 500,000 magic crystals. I understand, but Cold Spring Forest is massive. Zero Wing isn't even large enough to exploit 20% of the map's resource areas, much less 50%. Rather than holding useless territory, shouldn't we exchange it for something of value? Shifeng asked, chuckling. But, those Dark World players, Gentle Snow understood what Shifeng was trying to say. At this point, only Tier 3 players could freely roam level 100 neutral maps for long periods. Tier 2 players couldn't last for very long in such areas. Zero Wing's current forces simply weren't enough to occupy all of Cold Spring Forest's resource areas. Selling the additional spots was a wise decision, but if they considered the Dark World's powers and players, it'd be a completely different story. The Dark World's players are a problem, but only if they actually pose a threat to Zero Wing in Cold Spring Forest. Shifeng said, chuckling. Read latest chapters at Wuxia World. EU, Guild Leader, we're talking about the Dark World. I spoke with our guests earlier, and those two informed me that the Dark World is as large as 3 of the main continent's ordinary empires. The other world has even more players than the Fire Dragon Empire. We'll be facing a minimum of 20,000 Tier 3 experts, Gentle Snow continued, flashing Shifeng a bitter smile. And what if we have 2 or 3,000 fully armed, Tier 3 NPCs? Shifeng asked, smiling. Are you talking about the Night Division? Gentle Snow, more or less, realized where Shifeng was going with this. We still don't have the funds to upgrade them, who said that? Shifeng quipped. He then opened his epic spatial bag and emptied its contents inside the guild warehouse. Within a few dozen seconds, materials filled the expansive warehouse, and everyone was rare. Gentle Snow hadn't even seen many of these materials before. As the items tumbled out of Shifeng's bag, the mana density in the warehouse rose significantly. Chapter 2545, Astonishing Wealth. Gentle Snow stared at the materials Shifeng had revealed in a daze. As a vice guild leader, she had done extensive research on God's domain's materials, yet she didn't even recognize half of the items Shifeng had dumped in the warehouse. Even those she recognized were considered precious on the market, and normally, they were impossible to purchase, even for absurdly high prices. And yet, their guild warehouse was now packed full of such materials. The warehouses in Zero Wing's residences were easily as large as 4 basketball courts, but despite its size, Shifeng had filled it with incredibly valuable materials. They could rake in unimaginable profits if they sold them all. Guild Leader, did you acquire all of these materials from the Western continent? Gentle Snow asked. She was aware of his visit to the West, but since the guild had still needed management personnel, she had decided to stay behind. However, Shifeng hadn't spent long in the West, and even though he had left with millions of magic crystals, returning with such a bounty shouldn't be possible in such a short time. Rare materials were considered rare for a reason. There wasn't exactly a large supply of them on the market. To acquire as many materials as Shifeng had, one would have to sweep through multiple kingdoms and empires' auction houses. Moreover, once the various powers discovered that someone was purchasing certain rare materials in bulk, prices would skyrocket. To avoid that outcome, most purchased materials in small quantities over a long time. We spent quite a long time collecting these materials, Shifeng said, nodding. Smiling, he continued, how about it? Do you think dealing with those Dark World players will still be a problem? He had known about Demon's Heart's trump card for a long time. Before his visit to the Western continent, he never would have casually attacked the Dark Guild. He didn't want to become the entire world's enemy, after all. But times had changed, and he was now extremely wealthy. Magic crystals were worth far more on the Western continent than they were in the East. Hence, he had gotten a bigger bang for his buck. He estimated that the materials he had purchased for 3 million magic crystals in the west should fetch around 10 million gold in the east. At this stage of the game, not even superpowers could collect 10 million gold. At best, they might have 1 or 2 million to spare. You are really vicious, guild leader. I can't believe you got your hands on so many materials unique to the Western continent. The various superpowers would go mad if they found out about this, Gentle Snow said, excitement welling within her as Feng nodded victoriously. In God's domain, money was power. Whether one was trying to construct a guild city or provide their guild members more benefits, all required money. Hence, a rich guild could develop rapidly. Unfortunately, not only was God's domain's coin production limited, but players also had to cover many daily expenses. Even now, as players reached Tier 3, coins hadn't depreciated much, and there were even faint signs of them becoming more valuable. Now that Zero Wing had such a fortune, fully arming its night division and forming a true NPC army was entirely possible. I do have an important use for these materials, however. We can only sell half. I'll leave that to you. Make sure to find absolutely trustworthy people to do the job. If this news leaks, we'll have a hard time demanding high prices, Feng warned her. I understand. I ensure that every one of these items sells at an ideal price, and I'll make sure that none of the various superpowers learn of our wealth, Gentle Snow promised with a bright smile. She couldn't help but look forward to seeing the various superpowers' expressions when they saw Zero Wing's upgraded night division. Since Stone Forest City's relocation to Cold Spring Forest, many superpowers had been eyeing the city. As they gained more Tier 3 players, Zero Wing's control in the map had weakened, and due to the recent conflict with Demon's Heart, quite a few powers have started to cause trouble. At this rate, the various powers might assume they could fight Zero Wing for Cold Spring Forest's resource areas before the portal to the Dark World even activated. I'll leave everything to you, then, Feng said, nodding. Following which, Feng stealthily made his way to Stone Forest City's candlelight trading firm. While one of his goals in visiting the Western continent had been to earn a ton of money and materials, his main goal had been for the Tree of Life. The Tree of Life was only a tool, not a weapon, yet all powers sought the treasure. This was because the Tree of Life could produce a variety of rare items, not unlike an infinite treasure trove. Even super guilds would go crazy to obtain a Tree of Life main branch since they could produce Fruits of Life, a legendary material that could resurrect the dead. A single fruit could even grant creatures new life. Most players might not care about the ability to resurrect the dead, but countless dreamed of the ability to grant living creatures new life. Granting new life meant upgrading a creature's growth potential and life rating, which could be done to players, monsters, and NPCs. Moreover, there was almost no limit to the number of Fruits of Life an individual could consume, although each subsequent fruit would prove less effective. This ability was why Fruits of Life were the best cultivation fruit in God's domain. The main branch Feng had obtained had survived since before the Great Destruction. One could only imagine how valuable it was. Stone Forest City, candlelight trading firm. Due to how attractive Stone Forest City was to Tier 3 players and the fact that the candlelight trading firm sold all sorts of master potions, the shop had become a hub for the various adventurer teams. In fact, any adventurer team wishing to develop in Stone Forest City first became an advanced member in Candlelight. Plenty of lifestyle players visited the trading firm, as well. To keep up with the huge demand, Candlelight had split a portion of its basic orders with independent lifestyle players, while allowing Candlelight's members to focus on producing the more important products. Not only did this increase the trading firm's operation scale, but it also increased productivity. At the same time, it also allowed independent players a chance to earn proficiency points while practicing their crafts. The independent lifestyle players that worked for Candlelight could also earn contribution points and exchange them for a plethora of recipes and materials. They could even spend points to rent special workshops and basic meditation rooms. Due to such lucrative benefits, many independent lifestyle players with high standards had decided to develop in Stone Forest City. When Shifeng entered the candlelight trading firm, he found that the first-floor hall was practically full of adventurer team players and lifestyle players. The trading firm was no less popular than auction houses in NPC cities. Shifeng quickly made his way to one of the firm's basic meditation rooms, making many lifestyle players, who were waiting to rent a special workshop or basic meditation room, jealous. Who is that guy? They're just letting him enter a mediation room without waiting in line. I don't know, but he must be someone important. I've heard that only Candlelight's core members and independent players with a gold membership can enter mediation rooms as they wish. I wonder when I'll be able to become a gold member. Gold? You should thank your lucky stars if you even become a silver member. You know that even master lifestyle players only become bronze members. All lifestyle players dreamed of using basic meditation rooms due to their excellent training environments, but even the various superpowers lifestyle players had few opportunities to use them. The only reason that independent players like them had a chance to use a basic meditation room was Candlelight's booming popularity. If they could use the rooms whenever they wanted, they wouldn't have any trouble improving their skills. Of course, Shifeng ignored these independent players' jealousy. He merely entered the basic meditation room and retrieved the Tree of Life's main branch he had collected from the guild warehouse. Read latest chapters at Wuxia World. EU mana was the core of all in God's domain. Players would obtain better results in both combat training and producing items in higher mana density environments. Thus, to increase his chances of restoring the main branch, he had deliberately shut himself in a basic meditation room. With the main branch in hand, Shifeng carefully pulled a brightly glowing crystal from his bag. The instant it touched the air, it illuminated the room, and he felt the crystal radiate warmth. This crystal was none other than the Star of Light, a legendary material he had obtained from the demon god's temptation. This should be enough mana. I just hope it can live. Shifeng nervously gulped as he merged the Star of Light and Tree of Life's main branch. Chapter 2546, Divine Artifact. When Shifeng merged the Star of Light with the withered branch, the mana inside the basic meditation room started gathering rapidly around the branch. In less than 3 seconds, a layer of white mist had formed around the withered branch. Moreover, this still wasn't the end of it. Afterward, the mana mist started condensing into drops of liquid mana on the branch and the area around it. Subsequently, the liquid mana flowed toward and into the branch's broken end. And with each drop of liquid mana that entered the withered branch, the branch quivered, giving off ripples of energy, as if some kind of creature was awakening. It seems the results are quite good. Shifeng grew elated when he sensed the ripples of energy from the withered branch. Previously, when he saw that the withered rate of the branch had reached 94%, he had somewhat despaired of reviving the branch already. Fortunately, there was no failure when trying to revive a Tree of Life's branch. One merely needed to provide it with a continuous supply of high-density mana and life energy. So long as that condition was met in sufficient quantity, the branch would grow into another Tree of Life. The only problem was that the quantity and density of mana and life energy required would vary depending on a branch's withered rate. Meanwhile, the materials capable of supplementing the mana and life energy that a 94% withered main branch required were incredibly rare. Fortunately, Shifeng had been lucky on his trip to the western continent this time and secured himself a Star of Light. Without it, he really wouldn't have any hope of resuscitating the withered branch he had. Following which, time passed by rapidly. Before he knew it, 8 hours had passed already. During this period, the withered branch had continuously condensed and absorbed liquid mana. Combined with the Star of Light's essence, the branch was now brimming with life energy. In fact, it had even started leafing. As green leaves kept sprouting on the branch, the life energy it radiated grew denser. Now, the entire room was brimming with life. It just awoke, yet the life energy it's giving off is already so dense. What is the rank of this Tree of Life? Shifeng was a little surprised when he sensed the life energy filling the room. If players rest in this room, their recovery rate will most likely more than double. In God's domain, even after players reached Tier 3, they still wouldn't be immune to the corrosive energies in level 100+ maps, they would merely be more resistant to these energies. After the corruption reached a certain point, they would still have to return to cities to rest. Otherwise, they would collapse from hunger or exhaustion or simply outright die. This was also the reason behind Stone Forest City's rapid development. However, even if players returned to a city to rest, they would still take a very long time to recover to their peak. While wealthy players also had the option of consuming mana-rich food and beverages to accelerate their recovery, these only improved the recovery rate by a few dozen%. If players rested inside this room, however, their recovery rate would increase by at least 100%. This was simply incredible. After all, expert players of God's domain consumed food and beverages that accelerated their recovery rate on a regular basis, to have more time grinding and exploring. Those of guild upper echelons would even take ancient potions to increase their recovery rate, which was extremely expensive. The cheaper ones cost around 20 or 30 gold per bottle, while expensive ones cost over 100 gold. Ancient potions were all consumables whose effects lasted only 4 to 6 hours. However, combining the effects of ancient potions and food that boosted recovery rate could just barely double players' recovery rate. Now, however, a Tree of Life's branch that had just been revived could grant this effect merely by being present inside a room. If news of this spread, the various powers of God's domain would definitely go crazy with envy. After all, an ancient potion granted its effects to only one person. The Tree of Life's branch, however, could aid all the players resting inside the room it was in. Setting all else aside, this branch alone would already give Zero Wing's main force members a huge lead over the various superpowers experts when it came to leveling up and improving their strength. Meanwhile, as Sherfong was reeling in astonishment from the passive effects the Tree of Life's main branch displayed, the branch in question suddenly released an emerald glow. It then transformed into a sapling. The instant the sapling took shape, Sherfong felt an indescribably heavy pressure on him. The sapling had actually sucked the basic meditation room dry of mana. If not for Sherfong having fully unlocked his mana body, the sapling's action would have most likely killed him. Unable to hold back his curiosity, Sherfong promptly called out the sapling's attribute panel. Crap! It's actually a divine artifact. Sherfong was stunned when he saw the statistics displayed before him. Ancient Tree of Life's sapling, fragmented divine artifact rank, a sapling brimming with life energy. The sapling also contains a trace of the world's aura before the Great Destruction. This sapling is capable of producing 17 drops of water of life daily, 3 nuclei of life every 3 days, and 1 fruit of life every 7 days. This sapling can survive only in places with high mana density. Capable of growth. Requires a large amount of dense and pure energy to grow. Current growth rate 0%. Previously, he had merely speculated that the branch he obtained was a divine artifact because it had existed since ancient times, and the environment in ancient times was many times better than the environment in the current God's domain. However, he never thought that the main branch would actually turn out to be a divine artifact. Although it was a fragmented one, it was still a bona fide divine artifact. It wasn't some powerful legendary item labeled as a divine artifact. Divine artifacts could bring entire races to prosperity. They were existences that even ancient gods would fight tooth and nail for. Even the almighty war god's temple had only 2 divine artifacts in its warehouse. If news of this sapling got out, let alone players, even the NPC powers of God's domain would most likely take action, particularly the dark powers, which would definitely destroy Stone Forest City. In fact, they wouldn't mind drowning an entire empire in flames to get their hands on this sapling. Hence, while Sherfong was indeed ecstatic to see that the sapling turned out to be a fragmented divine artifact, his emotions were complicated as he looked at the sapling. Moreover, resuscitating a Tree of Life's branch wasn't the most difficult part about growing a Tree of Life. After all, so long as players found the right materials to supply the branch with mana and life energy, they would be able to revive it. Even if players didn't get the right materials on their first attempt, they could simply try again and eventually succeed. The truly challenging part of growing a tree of life was keeping it alive. Read latest chapters at Wuxia World. The Tree of Life had extremely stringent living conditions. If players failed to meet these conditions, let alone getting the Tree of Life to develop, it wouldn't be strange if the tree died. Then, players would have to find more materials to resuscitate it. One of the main conditions to keep a Tree of Life alive was to plant it in a location with sufficiently dense mana. Originally, Shi Feng had thought he could rely on Stone Forest City's environment to grow his Tree of Life. After all, even if he managed to revive his branch, it would only become a sapling. The amount of mana a sapling required wasn't as much as what a mature Tree of Life needed. In fact, with Stone Forest City's mana environment, he was confident he could grow even a legendary ranked sapling. However, for the fragmented divine artifact ranked sapling before him, he discovered that even one of the city's basic meditation rooms couldn't supply the sapling's mana requirements. It seems that if I don't upgrade Stone Forest City, I can't even touch this Tree of Life. Shi Feng revealed a bitter smile as he looked at the sapling hovering before him. He then contacted Gentle Snow and asked, "Snow, how are things coming along on your side?" Chapter 2547, Foundations Ready, Reconstructing Stone Forest City. I already had my men make the necessary preparations. However, quite a few superpowers are selling the Western continent's materials right now, so we'll have to wait a while to get a better price, Gentle Snow answered upon hearing Shi Feng's question. Although the Western continent's rare materials were very precious on the Eastern continent, there were still some superpowers that sold them. To get a better price for the materials Shi Feng brought back and to avoid significant price fluctuations, they had to not only split the materials across numerous kingdoms and empires but also consider the timing and sell only the materials that were unavailable or in low supply. Only by doing so would they be able to get the best price for their materials. For the current Zero Wing, though, handling these matters wasn't a problem at all. Stop waiting. Sell whatever you can right now, Shi Feng said after giving the matter some thought. So soon? Gentle Snow was a little confused by Shi Feng's decision. The price they could get from selling the materials quickly would be considerably different from what they would get if they sold the materials gradually. After all, not everybody had a use for the Western continent's rare materials. If they sold these materials in bulk, they would saturate the market very quickly, which would reduce their profits. I'm in urgent need of money right now, Shi Feng said, nodding. If possible, he would prefer not to act precipitately, either. However, plans were always subject to change. He never thought that the Tree of Life's branch he obtained would really turn out to be a divine artifact, albeit a fragmented one. The density of the mana that a fragmented divine artifact ranked Tree of Life's sapling required was something even the basic meditation room, the place with the highest ambient mana in Stone Forest City, was incapable of supplying. A Tree of Life's sapling was different from other items. Once it formed, it could not be stored inside a bag for however long players wanted. Instead, it would live for just 2 or 3 days. If players failed to provide it with an adequate living environment, then it would wilt and revert into a branch. Moreover, ordinary bags couldn't store a Tree of Life sapling, as the sapling was a non-bag space item. Fortunately, Shi Feng had the epic spatial bag, which was capable of storing non-bag space items. Otherwise, he would have no choice but to leave the sapling to die inside the basic meditation room. Meanwhile, in God's domain, there were only 3 methods to increase the mana density of a city. The first method was to build constructions that raised the density of mana. However, aside from the mana tower, players had to find the designs for other similar constructions on their own. Moreover, designs for constructions capable of raising a city's mana density by a significant margin were incomparably valuable, easily surpassing fragmented legendary items in value. Any power that obtained such a design would definitely choose to use it themselves instead of selling or trading it away. Zero Wing did not possess such a design at the moment, so this route was not viable. The second method was just as difficult to fulfill as the first method, and that was to install a better power source in the city's core magic array, which would raise the mana density inside the city. The third method was the one most used in the past, and that was to raise the rank of the city. When a city's rank increased, the standard of its core magic array would improve, as well. As a result, the city's mana density would increase significantly. The promotion of a guild city required a sufficiently large player population and painstaking work. It wasn't something that could be achieved swiftly. However, it was also the easiest way to raise the mana density of a city. Currently, in terms of prosperity and security standards, Stone Forest City already met the requirements of an intermediate city. Its popularity was now the only thing holding back the city's promotion. Normally, the city would take a lot more time to accumulate the required popularity. However, there was a shortcut to raising a city's popularity: erecting advanced constructions. Building an advanced construction in a guild city would instantly grant the city a large amount of city popularity. In Stone Forest City's current state, the addition of just one advanced construction would be sufficient to elevate the city to the intermediate city standard. At that time, not only the city's size but also the mana density inside the city would increase by a large margin. However, Shifeng currently did not possess an advanced construction design. All he had was the design for the Freedom Hotel, a peak construction. Although a peak construction would grant much more popularity than an advanced construction would upon completion, its construction cost was also a lot higher. Building a peak construction required not only extremely rare materials but also a lot of coins. Not to mention, the construction cost would differ, depending on the size of the peak construction. As far as Shifeng knew, the material costs aside, even the cheapest peak construction cost 1 million gold. Fortunately, all the materials necessary to construct the Freedom Hotel were already on hand. The only thing he lacked was funds. Currently, Zero Wing had less than 150,000 gold to spare. That was nowhere near the amount necessary. The only reliable way that Shifeng could think of to earn a large sum within 2 or 3 days was selling the Western continent's materials. I understand. I'll try to sell all the materials the various kingdoms and empires lack as soon as possible. If it's still not enough, I can also sell materials that are already available on the market, Gentle Snow said, nodding when she saw the serious look on Shifeng's face. I'll leave it to you, then, Shifeng said before disconnecting the call. He then left the candlelight trading firm and personally conducted the preparation work necessary to construct the Freedom Hotel. As one of the few peak constructions available in God's domain, the Freedom Hotel was not easy to build. It required not only a large number of master architects but also a large number of master magicians. Without the technical expertise of a master magician, one shouldn't even think of constructing the Freedom Hotel. This was also the reason why Shifeng had not been in a hurry to construct the Freedom Hotel even after obtaining its design. Meanwhile, as Shifeng was gathering the necessary workforce to construct the Freedom Hotel, the various superpowers members, who were keeping an eye on Zero Wing's every action, were stupefied by this situation. What's Black Flame trying to do? The Dark World's invasion is about to start, yet instead of making preparations for battle, he's having a bunch of architects run around the city? Maybe he is going to construct additional defensive structures to reassure Stone Forest City's players. I heard that this incident more than halved Stone Forest City's profits. Once the Dark World's players invade, instead of generating profits, Stone Forest City might end up a money pit instead. If Black Flame knew something like this would happen, why did he provoke Demon's Heart in the first place? Does he think a few defensive structures will be enough to stop the Dark World's players? Let alone Zero Wing's Guild City, even a guild city operated by 5 superpowers wouldn't be able to stop all of the Dark World's players. The various superpowers secretly ridiculed Shifeng when they saw him running around the city busily. The Dark World's invasion was imminent, yet Shifeng was actually doing something as futile as constructing a few additional defensive structures instead of trying to recruit superpowers to help him repulse this invasion. In this situation, Zero Wing's members also could not help panicking. Previously, they had been very confident in Stone Forest City's defenses. After all, no power had ever managed to break through the city's defenses thus far. Now, however, their opponent was not a single power but an entire otherworld instead. No one knew whether Stone Forest City could hold its ground against such a force. Meanwhile, over in the Black Dragon Empire, Gentle Snow wore an ecstatic expression on her face as she oversaw the sales of materials. System: the Demon Heart Flower, 1 stack, you placed at the auction house has been sold. After deducting the procedural fees, 20 gold 27 silver have been deposited into your bag space. System: the Magically Refined Iron, 1 stack, you placed at the auction house has been sold. After deducting the procedural fees, 55 gold 21 silver have been deposited into your bag space. System: the Crimson Timber you placed at the auction house has been sold. After deducting the procedural fees, 89 gold 76 silver have been deposited into your bag space. It had only been half an hour since she gave the sell order to her subordinates, and the materials they put up for auction were already being hotly contested. She had expected to gain only 400,000 gold from the first batch of materials they had prepared to sell. Now, despite having sold less than half of the first batch, they had already made over 350,000 gold. The demand for the materials far surpassed her projections. What Gentle Snow did not know was that, while superpowers were indeed selling the Western continent's materials, these superpowers were selling only a small portion of their stockpile. They had kept the majority for their own use. Meanwhile, these small amounts of materials might be useful for the individual player or adventurer team, but they were hardly of any use to a large guild, which would rather ignore them than waste time bidding over scraps. However, Gentle Snow was selling materials necessary for producing master potions and level 100+ weapons and equipment, and in impressive amounts. For the various large guilds that were desperately trying to explore level 100 neutral maps, these materials were a godsend. Hence, for a time, the various large guilds were crazily competing against each other over the materials Gentle Snow and her subordinates sold. And in less than half a day, they had sold half of their stockpile of materials, netting more than 4 million gold, nearly double their expected profits. Read latest chapters at Wuxia World. EU. This outcome astonished even Sherfong. It's no wonder those first-rate powers that were capable of intercontinental travel eventually developed into superpowers. This is simply a jackpot. Sherfong sighed ruefully when he received the 4.11 million gold from Gentle Snow's subordinate. In Sherfeng's opinion, even selling the materials for 4 or 5 times their original price would already have been plenty exaggerated. After all, ordinary players couldn't afford the materials he brought back. Only the various major powers would have the means to purchase them. Now, however, he had earned more than 10 times the original cost of these materials. If he could make a few more business trips like this, he would most likely have enough money to drown an entire superpower to death. However, while Sherfong was indeed surprised by this outcome, he did not stop working. After making sure the area he stood on was sealed off from the public, he took out a thick, ancient tome from his bag. This tome was none other than the Freedom Hotel design. System: you now possess all the necessary construction materials and land to construct the Freedom Hotel. Do you wish to start its construction? Chapter 2548, Freedom Hotel surprise appearance. Upon receiving the system notification, Sherfong took a deep breath and chose to construct the Freedom Hotel. Immediately afterward, he received another system notification. System: please choose the size of the Freedom Hotel you wish to build. A small one will cost 1,200,000 gold, a medium one will cost 1,500,000 gold, and a large one will cost 2 million gold. Sure enough, it really is expensive. Sherfong was flabbergasted when he saw the prices listed. Although he had known that peak constructions cost a ton to build, he still found it difficult to accept after seeing the prices with his own eyes. With 1.2 million gold, one could easily construct 2 or 3 guild cities. It was an astronomical amount of money, even for superpowers, enough to let a first-rate guild achieve rapid development. Now, however, this sum was necessary just to construct a small Freedom Hotel. It was no exaggeration to say that peak constructions were things that only the various superpowers could afford. Other powers would only be able to use the design as a decoration. Constructing the real thing would be beyond their means. After seeing these prices, Sherfong chose to construct a large Freedom Hotel without hesitation. Originally, he had planned to construct only a small Freedom Hotel for the sole purpose of upgrading Stone Forest City into an intermediate city. However, since he had gained a much larger harvest than he initially expected from selling the Western continent's rare materials, he naturally had no need to be stingy with his coins. After all, the difference between a small Freedom Hotel and a large Freedom Hotel was massive. Although both small and large Freedom Hotels possessed the same functions, a small Freedom Hotel had only 8 floors. In comparison, a large Freedom Hotel had a total of 32 floors. Starting out with a small Freedom Hotel and gradually upgrading it into a large Freedom Hotel would also be many times more expensive than constructing a large Freedom Hotel directly. Hence, in a situation where funds were plentiful, most powers would choose to construct a large Freedom Hotel from the get-go. As soon as Shifeng chose to construct a large Freedom Hotel, 2 million gold disappeared from his bag space, the coins transforming into a streak of golden light that flowed into the Freedom Hotel design in his hands. In the next moment, construction magic arrays started appearing on the tome's numerous pages. Every one of these designs was extremely complex, and even the simplest one was an advanced magic array. If someone below the Master Magician standard were to look at these magic arrays, they would most likely have a huge headache. Fortunately, most of these magic arrays could be retrieved from the design and engraved on the finished construction directly. Otherwise, if Shifeng had to do all the magic arrays required for the Freedom Hotel from scratch, he definitely wouldn't be able to manage, short of reaching the Grandmaster Magician standard. Alright, everyone, start working, Shifeng said after seeing the magic arrays appear on the design. In the next moment, over 100 architects sprang into action while holding a copy of the Freedom Hotel design. Some architects started refining materials, while some started fragmenting materials. The construction of the Freedom Hotel progressed smoothly under Shifeng's direction. As for Shifeng himself, he frantically engraved magic arrays on the finished portions of the Freedom Hotel. At the same time as Shifeng was constructing the Freedom Hotel, inside a high-class restaurant in a border town of the Ten Saints Empire. Currently, not only was the restaurant fully booked, but several dozen Tier 3 peak experts also stood guard around it. The imposing aura these players exuded deterring passers-by from approaching the restaurant. Several people were seated inside the restaurant's top-floor room. If the upper echelons of the Ten Saints Empire's various superpowers were to see these people, they would definitely receive a fright. This was because every player inside this room was a big shot in God's domain. They were existences capable of shaking up entire kingdoms and empires with their decisions. Among those present, the person with the highest status would have to be Cold Shadow, a Vice Guild leader of mythology. Vice Guild Leader Light, how are the preparations on your side coming along? I heard that the Dark World's Dark Rhapsody and Deity Society have signed a non-interference agreement with Zero Wing, a level 108, white-clad, elderly man sporting Pantheon's guild emblem asked as he looked at the indifferent and handsome youth seated beside him. Our preparations are nearly complete. The Dark World's side just needs a little more time. Elder South, please rest assured. Those two guilds might have great influence over the Dark World, but the number of experts they command are nothing when compared to the expert population of the entire Dark World. In addition, we have reached an agreement with World Domination, which will help us add fuel to the fire. At that time, so long as no power assists Zero Wing, Stone Forest City will fall quickly, the handsome youth named Flaming Light replied with a chuckle. You can also rest assured on this point, Vice Guild Leader Light. Starlink has already sent greetings to the various powers operating around Stone Forest City. They definitely will not assist Zero Wing in fending off the Dark World's experts, Lu Xinglua said, smiling. Originally, Lu Xinglua had been racking his brain over how to deal with Zero Wing, which was growing stronger by the day. However, Shifeng had actually dared offend a hot potato like Demon's Heart. Since that was the case, Lu Xinglua naturally wouldn't mind sending Zero Wing on its way. An entire world filled with dark players. Even Lu Xinglua himself did not have the confidence to go up against such a force, yet Shifeng had actually taken the initiative to challenge this force. Zero Wing's guild leader simply did not know the meaning of death. So long as Zero Wing lost the goldmine known as Stone Forest City, with Starlink's financial strength, stomping Zero Wing to death would be a piece of cake. When the time comes, I'll have to rely on everyone present. As for the distribution of Stone Forest City's shares that comes afterward, Demon's Heart will take no part in it. Moreover, I believe the Dark World's top 3 guilds also won't dare interfere in this matter. Everyone present will be free to decide what to do with Stone Forest City. I only hope that we can put a swift end to this affair. If Zero Wing focuses fully on defense, I'm afraid even our side will have trouble taking down Stone Forest City, Flaming Light said. You don't have to worry about this point, Cold Shadow said suddenly. I have already promised Stone Forest City's various adventurer teams that I will purchase their materials at a high price and also let them exchange for a limited number of combat runes. I believe Stone Forest City's adventurer teams will no longer sell their materials to Zero Wing. Without the materials of these adventurer teams, Zero Wing won't be able to sustain its daily operations. Once the Dark World's portal opens, Zero Wing won't even be able to gather materials on its own. In that case, Zero Wing will implode in a matter of days. Upon hearing Cold Shadow's words, everyone present could not help but gasp in shock at her ruthlessness. Combat runes were items unique to the Western continent and were something the Eastern continent's various powers had been dreaming of obtaining, in order to raise the combat power of their members by a large margin. If an entire team were equipped with combat runes, it would have a much easier time raiding team dungeons and field bosses. Due to the effectiveness of the combat runes, the Eastern continent's various superpowers were sparing no expense to purchase them, with some going as far as using magic crystals for payment. Adventurer teams didn't even get a chance to purchase these combat runes. Now that Cold Shadow was offering to let Stone Forest City's adventurer teams exchange for some combat runes, those adventurer teams would definitely accept her offer without hesitation. With this, Zero Wing would truly have to fend off the Dark World's invasion by itself. Due to this matter, the members of Stone Forest City's adventurer teams were currently holding secret discussions. At the same time, they were also gathering materials to exchange for Mythology's combat runes. They were not selling any of the materials they harvested from Cold Spring Forest to Zero Wing at all. Read latest chapters at Wuxia World. Zero Wing really knows how to hold its breath. Our adventurer teams have clearly stopped supplying it with materials, yet instead of raising its purchasing price, it is actually constructing something new. Does Zero Wing really think it can survive the Dark World's invasion with just a few additional defensive structures? Maybe Zero Wing is trying to make a quick buck before it falls. After all, so long as the Dark World's portal opens, everything will be over. As the adventurer team players looked at the magic array enveloping the Freedom Hotel, which was under construction, they could not help speculating about it among themselves. So what if Zero Wing's black flame was strong? It was useless even if he had the strength to go up against a superpower single-handedly. After all, before an entire world's players, even super guilds would be powerless. Meanwhile, as Stone Forest City's players were quietly discussing among themselves, the magic array concealing the Freedom Hotel suddenly shattered. With the magic array's disappearance, a 32-story building on Stone Forest City's main street came into view. At 150 meters tall, it overlooked the entire city. Chapter 2549, Promotion to Intermediate City. What a huge building. What's going on? Can a basic city have such a tall construction? Players on the main street were stunned when the Freedom Hotel was suddenly revealed. Previously, the tallest building in Stone Forest City had only been 100 meters tall, but not only did the Freedom Hotel reach another 50 meters above that, but it also occupied a shockingly large area. It easily covered the area of a large-scale sports stadium. Such incredible buildings were even rare in NPC cities, let alone guild cities. The Freedom Hotel's sheer size stunned everyone who saw it. While nearby players discussed this new construction, the Zero Wing members responsible for building the Freedom Hotel were astonished by their own creation. They had known that they had been building an extraordinary superstructure, but they hadn't understood how amazing it truly was until after the Freedom Hotel's completion. Outsiders had no idea how impressive the hotel really was, but they, who had built it, were perfectly aware. The Freedom Hotel was like another world. It was bigger on the inside than it appeared, and the mana density within was frighteningly high. The Freedom Hotel's mana was around 2 or 3 times denser than in the outside world. Not even Candlelight's basic meditation rooms could compare. Moreover, that had been before the Freedom Hotel had been complete. There was a major difference between complete and incomplete structures in God's domain. A construction in the game functioned like one massive magic array. It wouldn't be complete until the final magic array had been engraved, unable to function. The building would only exhibit its full potential once that task had been accomplished. In other words, the mana density Zero Wings members had felt inside the Freedom Hotel had been a result of the rare materials they had used. It hadn't been amplified by any magic arrays. That wasn't the only thing that amazed Zero Wings architects. None of them had realized the complete building would stand 150 meters tall. Stone Forest City was surrounded by the Cold Spring Forest, and during their meeting on the 27th floor, they had been mesmerized by the view. If they had an opportunity to stay a night on the Freedom Hotel's top floor, they'd jump at the chance, regardless of the price. Players would also rapidly earn the double EXP buff while in the hotel due to the high mana density. Staying in the hotel would substantially boost their leveling speed. After all, every player grinding in level 100 neutral maps had to return to a city to rest sooner or later, and if players could earn the double EXP buff while resting, their leveling speed would be greatly affected. While Zero Wings architects were in awe of the Freedom Hotel's future prospects, Shifeng looked at the peak construction and sighed ruefully. He had only witnessed superpowers Freedom Hotels during his previous life, yet now, Zero Wing had one of its own. Peak constructions weren't just rare in God's domain, their powerful abilities were the true reason that drove countless powers crazy. Before Shifeng could call up the hotel's system interface and inspect it properly, however, he heard the sounds of a series of system notifications. System: the large Freedom Hotel is complete. All players involved in the construction receive level +1 and 8,000 free lifestyle proficiency points. System: the large Freedom Hotel is complete. Stone Forest City's popularity increased by 100,000 points, city prosperity level +1, and Stone Forest City's popularity accumulation speed increased by 10%. System: congratulations. Stone Forest City is the first guild city to own a peak construction. Rewarding: Freedom City title. This title will encourage more NPCs to visit Stone Forest City. System: Stone Forest City has met the qualifications for its promotion into an intermediate city. Do you wish to promote it to an intermediate city? By the time the system notifications ended, Shifeng had risen from level 111 to level 112, saving several days of grinding. The abundant rewards even surprised him. I got the Freedom City title, just like that. Shifeng stared at the system notifications, at a loss for words. Obtaining titles in God's domain was relatively easy, but the same couldn't be said for towns and cities. Every power with a guild city dreamed of obtaining the Freedom City title, in particular. Not only would more human NPCs visit a city with the title, but other races' NPCs would also make their way to the city, especially NPC merchants and soldiers. The title would allow Stone Forest City to recruit more human NPC soldiers and those of other races. Of all the races in God's domain, humans weren't particularly talented. They neither had impressive physiques and an affinity for the earth as giants did, nor did they have the magical gifts or keen senses of the elves and Ors, respectively. To put it simply, humans didn't have any outstanding advantages. Their legacies and relentless research were the only reasons that humans were able to occupy a significant portion of the main continent. There was also the fact that there were more humans than other races. In terms of combat power, human NPCs were far inferior to giants, elves, and Ors. Shifeng didn't give the matter much thought, however. The Freedom City title might be a major boon, but it wouldn't be immediately effective. More importantly, Stone Forest City was ready for its promotion. An intermediate city. Current powers might not yet realize how important an intermediate city was. They only saw it as a larger city, able to accommodate more players. At best, it could rival NPC cities. However, the various powers weren't aware that guild cities were not like their NPC counterparts. The two didn't even fall into the same category. Basic guild cities only had the shape of a city, but they become true cities once they reached intermediate rank. This was why Reshaping had wanted to upgrade his city before transferring it to a level 100 neutral map. The city's defensive system would only truly activate once it became an intermediate city, and only then would a guild city have the foundation to survive in such a high-level area. Naturally, Reshaping didn't hesitate to promote Stone Forest City. System: Stone Forest City is located in Cold Spring Forest, a level 100 neutral map. Promoting it into an intermediate city will cost 500,000 gold and 100,000 magic crystals. Do you wish to proceed? Promote. Reshaping confirmed. The gold and magic crystals instantly vanished from Reshaping's bag, and a gigantic magic barrier enveloped Stone Forest City before all players were teleported outside of its walls. What's going on? Why was I suddenly teleported outside? What's happening to Stone Forest City? Read latest chapters at Wuxia World. The players looked up at the magic barrier around the city in stunned confusion. They had no idea what was happening. After a moment, however, some guild players' expressions shifted to shock. Is Zero Wing relocating Stone Forest City again? No, I've seen some guild towns promotions before. This magic barrier looks similar. I think Zero Wing is promoting the city. What? Are you serious? Stone Forest City is being promoted. Chapter 2550, Stone Forest City. Stone Forest City's being promoted. When they heard someone mention Stone Forest City's promotion, the crowd, which had been forcefully teleported out of the city, fell silent as everyone stared at the magic barrier in astonishment. Guild towns' promotions had already become a common sight, but not a single guild had upgraded its city to intermediate rank. The promotion requirements were just too high, and fulfilling them required a long time. And yet, when the various superpowers only had a few basic guild cities under their control, and none were in level 100 neutral maps, Zero Wing was promoting Stone Forest City. Stone Forest City has actually met the promotion requirements. Zero Wing really lucked out. With an intermediate city's defenses, even the Dark World's players will have a hard time taking it down. You're not seeing the big picture. Stone Forest City has merely become an intermediate city. It isn't a main city. How much stronger could its defenses have possibly become? Not even an advanced NPC city is guaranteed to hold its ground against all the players in an otherworld, much less an intermediate guild city. That's right. As long as those players capture Stone Forest City, Zero Wing will regret promoting its city even more. Although everyone was surprised by Stone Forest City's promotion to intermediate rank, they didn't think it was good news for Zero Wing. The Dark World still posed a threat. The news quickly reached the various superpowers' upper echelons. They fell into heated discussions about the situation. Ten Saints Empire, Crimson Emperor's residence, upper echelons lounge, and here I thought Zero Wing would do something outstanding. So, its trump card turns out to be an intermediate city, a fierce man in the lounge disdainfully commented as he read the latest report on Stone Forest City. He had already reached level 108 and radiated a lethal aura. The man turned his gaze on the woman in white resting nearby and continued, "Illusory, it seems your gamble won't pay off. Does Zero Wing truly think an intermediate city can stop the Dark World's forces and various superpowers' joint assault? The Grand Elders aren't pleased with you after your strong objections to partnering with Demon's Heart. If Zero Wing can't even survive in Cold Spring Forest, not only will you lose your position as Vice Guild Leader, but they might also stick you with the reserves forever. I merely offered a suggestion. Wasn't the Guild Leader responsible for the final decision?" Illusory words shot back, rolling her eyes. Earnestly, she continued, "I still can't shake the feeling that Zero Wing won't go down so easily. This is just like the shock I felt when Black Flame and his team actually broke into Demon City. Besides, even if Crimson Emperor doesn't participate in the assault, we have nothing to lose, right? We might not lose anything, but dark players will rule God's domain in the future. Demon's Heart's development speed is astounding. Based on our reports, Demon's Heart has secretly allied with several powers that are just as strong as super guilds. If we form a beneficial relationship with Demon's Heart, developing in level 100 neutral maps will be much easier in the future, the fierce man prudently countered. If we participate in Demon's Heart's plan, Crimson Emperor can befriend the Dark Guild and secure a share of Stone Forest City's benefits. The Grand Elders are likely cursing you for the suggestion right about now. This should have been a chance for Crimson Emperor to profit, but that chance is gone. They'll definitely make you pay for it. Don't blame me for this. There's no harm in being careful. The guild leader likely agreed to my suggestion, thinking the same. God's domain is too unstable right now, and the atmosphere among the various superpowers is growing tenser. Once the Dark World connects to the main continent, we'll reach a tipping point. I wouldn't even be surprised if we see superpowers fall, Illusory Words said, smiling bitterly. Initially, she hadn't wanted to dissuade her guild from allying with Demon's Heart and attacking Zero Wing with the other superpowers. She actually agreed that Zero Wing was doomed this time. However, when she recalled Shifeng's performance in Demon City and his mythical display in the Dark Den, she hadn't been able to keep silent against partnering with Demon's Heart. Others might think her suggestion had been ludicrous, but only those who had personally experienced the shock of watching Shifeng single-handedly stop a Tier 5 Demon King's attack would understand how frighteningly powerful the swordsman was. You'll have to explain yourself to the Grand Elders. They just instructed me to visit Stone Forest City with our main force. If Zero Wing's position is lacking, we'll cooperate with the other superpowers, the fierce man said, shrugging helplessly. They're acting already. Illusory Words was a little surprised. Is Demon's Heart on the move? They had only received news of Stone Forest City's promotion a few minutes ago, yet the guild's Grand Elders had already decided to abandon Zero Wing if the situation turned south. Not even the guild leader had opposed the decision. The guild leader and Grand Elders must have received some shocking news about Demon's Heart to drive them to act. They never would have changed their minds so quickly, otherwise. I suspect that's the case, the fierce man said before standing up. He then asked, do you want to come with us? Yes. Illusory Words nodded. If I don't, the Grand Elders will likely view my suggestion as even less reliable. Following which, the fierce man and Illusory Words made their way towards Stone Forest City with Crimson Emperor's main force members. 2 hours after players had been forced out of Stone Forest City, the barrier around it began to crack. Within seconds, it shattered and vanished, revealing a completely new guild city. When the players resting in the nearby forest saw the new city, they were utterly dumbfounded. Stone Forest City's walls had undergone a heaven-defying transformation. Originally, the city walls had only been around a dozen meters tall, but now, they were more than 30 meters. The walls had also been rebuilt with completely different materials. It looked like an iron beast had curled itself around the city. Moreover, magic runes covered the entire length of the walls, giving them a strangely heavy feeling. Read latest chapters at Wuxia World. The city's buildings had also changed significantly. Not only were all of the city's constructions much larger than before, but they also radiated an indescribable pressure. Even from over 1,000 meters away, players felt as if something or someone had locked onto their auras. Even more shocking was the mana Stone Forest City radiated. Players had already been amazed by the mana density in Stone Forest City. It was no exaggeration to claim that no other guild city in God's domain was its match in this regard, but now, Stone Forest City's mana density had reached newfound highs. There was even a faint white mist enveloping everything within the city's walls. Crap! Is that really Stone Forest City? Did Zero Wing replace Stone Forest City with some other city? Chapter 2551, Intermediate Cities Effects. The crowd began to converse as they stared at the transformed Stone Forest City. However, Zero Wing's members were more shocked than anyone. The moment the seal on the city had lifted, Zero Wing's members had been allowed back in. As they entered the city, they were mesmerized. Aside from the city's mana density, which players could feel from outside of it, these players were stunned by the city's new infrastructure. Not only did the buildings look completely different, but quite a few were now shops, run by non-human NPCs. These shops sold special magic scrolls, potions, food, and drinks that were usually very scarce on the market. Most importantly, Stone Forest City now had NPC trading firms' shops. These new shops might look like the ones ordinary NPCs owned, but NPC trading firms often issued quests for players. Once players had earned enough reputation points with a particular NPC trading firm, they could receive special, high-ranked quests that offered bountiful rewards, and if they were lucky, they could even obtain high-quality weapons and equipment by completing these quests. These NPC trading firms were one of the main reasons that even now, independent and guild players frequently visited NPC cities. Now that Stone Forest City had some of these trading firms' shops as well, they could continue to earn reputation points and pick up quests, saving them the trouble of returning to an NPC city. What did you do, guild leader? Is this really Stone Forest City? Gentle Snow asked, her heart pounding as she gazed around the main street. Stone Forest City now had just as many high-rise buildings and advanced shops as White River City. Truthfully, she would have assumed that she had entered a major NPC city, if not for the eye-catching Freedom Hotel. The biggest difference between NPC and guild cities was the presence of these NPC trading firms. They were responsible for nearly half of the quests available in NPC cities. These quests granted abundant EXP, but they also offered high monetary rewards. Even for expert players, these quests were a main source of income. This was why players were still tied to NPC cities. If they ignored these quests, they'd lose half of their income, and that would make it difficult for ordinary players to survive in God's domain. The chances of acquiring rare materials and equipment in level 100 maps were incredibly low, after all. At this point, ordinary players only grinded for EXP in level 100 maps, they didn't rely on these areas as a stable source of income. Now that Stone Forest City was home to so many NPC trading firms' advanced shops, the resident players wouldn't have to return to an NPC city to pick up or turn in the trading firm's quests. They could simply do so in Stone Forest City. This additional feature would only be a minor convenience for ordinary players, but for the various powers, this would allow them to shake off the shackles that bound them to NPC cities. If other powers had this feature in their guild cities, they would be able to thrive independently, even without the help of NPC cities. They could develop wherever they wished. Of course, this is Stone Forest City. Once a guild city reaches intermediate rank, it gains the ability to survive independently in the fields, Shifeng said, smiling at Gentle Snow's ecstatic expression. There might only be one rank between a basic city and an intermediate city, but it was like the difference between heaven and earth. This was why he had been so eager to upgrade Stone Forest City to intermediate rank. As an intermediate city, Stone Forest City could thrive perfectly well, even if Zero Wing lost Star Moon Kingdom. At this stage of the game, the competition in NPC cities had grown intense, and they were no longer under player control. As a result, managing NPC cities had become incredibly troublesome, and there was a risk of other powers taking over. In contrast, players had full control over guild cities. If other powers wanted to take one over, they'd have to capture it. However, Shifeng considered the Freedom Hotel's completion as far more important than Stone Forest City's promotion. The hotel would be the key that would lead a guild city to prosperity. Not only was the Freedom Hotel's mana incredibly dense, but players could also set up teleportation arrays within. Unlike NPC cities, there were no return scrolls for guild cities, and gaining them was a major challenge. Freedom Hotels, however, could meet that challenge. Any of the Freedom Hotel's guests could purchase return scrolls and teleport to it at any time and from anywhere. This feature was immensely convenient for players that didn't have a residence or house within the city. Aside from the convenience it offered combat players, the Freedom Hotel would be significantly helpful to lifestyle players. Not only would players accumulate the double EXP buff when resting in the hotel, but they would also earn the double lifestyle proficiency buff. Unfortunately, they couldn't accumulate the proficiency buff quite as fast as the double EXP, but it was a precious bonus to lifestyle players. Tools and potions that increased one's lifestyle proficiency acquisition rate were still insanely expensive on the market, far out of ordinary players' budgets. Guild leader, our members are in place. Should we open Stone Forest City now? Gentle Snow reported once she had calmed down. To cope with the Dark World's invasion, they had dispatched a large fraction of the guild's manpower to Stone Forest City. Even though the city was now much larger, they could still manage it without issues. Moreover, Gentle Snow was eager to show the city off to the public. Once Stone Forest City reopened, independent experts would likely have a hard time sitting still. They might even decide to join Zero Wing after discovering the city's changes. Zero Wing was now the only guild to break free from NPC kingdoms and empires, and with the city's help, the guild's members could level up far faster than other players. Read latest chapters at Wuxia World. EU, let's wait. We can open the city once I'm done with the Freedom Hotel, Shifeng said. The Freedom Hotel? Gentle Snow was a little confused. The hotel had already been constructed. What more needed to be done? Shifeng didn't explain, however, and instructed her to refine Stone Forest City's management and entrance fee collection. He then headed to the nearby Freedom Hotel. Once he stood in the hotel's inner courtyard, which he had built personally, Shifeng retrieved the ancient Tree of Life's sapling from his bag. The mana density here should be the highest within the city. If not even this is enough, I'll be out of options. Chapter 2552, Fragmented Divine Artifacts effects. As Shifeng exposed the Tree of Life's sapling to the air in the quiet courtyard, the mana in the area rampaged, frantically gathering around the sapling. After a moment, Shifeng felt a pulse of life from the sapling, and its aura grew powerful enough to be visible. The surrounding plants began to grow with astonishing speed as the green energy reached them. Success! Shifeng released a held breath as he watched the sapling's reaction. If this courtyard's mana hadn't been dense enough to accommodate the sapling, he would have had no choice but to give up on it and try to nurture the young tree after promoting Stone Forest City into a main city. However, upgrading a guild city to that rank was incredibly difficult. Not only did the ruling guild need to be powerful enough, but it would also need a lot of time to develop its city. Carefully, Shifeng planted the sapling in the center of the courtyard. He had designed the courtyard and specifically reserved a plot of land in its center for the Tree of Life. To be precise, he had designed a small island in the center of a lake within the courtyard. Not only had he engraved a mana-gathering magic array into the lake bed, but he had also embedded plenty of mana stones into the soil. As a result, the lake water brimmed with mana. Overall, the lake alone had a daily upkeep of nearly 200 mana stones. The various superpowers of his past had considered this the standard configuration for growing a Tree of Life. The necessary mana stones required to maintain the Tree of Life alone would have been more than enough to give current first-rate guilds a heart attack. Ordinary powers simply couldn't afford to play with Trees of Life. Fortunately, he had the Philosopher's Hand. After Shifeng planted the sapling, the air in the courtyard seemed to vibrate. The tranquil, cool atmosphere became scorchingly hot for a time. It even got to Shifeng. After about 3 seconds, the sapling shot up into a large, emerald tree. Its trunk was so thick that it would require 3 fully grown men to just barely be able to wrap their arms around it. The instant the tree reached maturity, dense life aura spread throughout the inner courtyard, tinting everything with a faint shade of green. The high temperature also began to fall to a pleasant warmth. Shifeng felt as if he were standing in the middle of a field on a warm, sunny day. Is this an effect of a fragmented divine artifact? Shifeng wondered, astonished, as he felt the transformations to the inner courtyard. Just planting the Tree of Life had filled the courtyard with life energy, and it was incredibly dense. Bathing in the aura, Shifeng could sense the foreign energy within him rapidly disappear, and his mind felt unusually refreshed. This sensation wasn't like the calm indifference players experienced when around highly dense mana. Rather, Shifeng's mind felt pure and rejuvenated. It was as if all of his thoughts had been given clear, distinct paths, and he knew exactly what to do. If players could practice combat techniques here, they would have a much easier time learning them. Players needed a clear understanding of the techniques to practice and better execute them, after all. It's a pity that I can't let just anyone enter this courtyard. Shifeng gave the Tree of Life a bitter smile. The Tree of Life had already taken root, and any player could discover the tree's identity with an ordinary identification skill. If news got out that Stone Forest City housed a fragmented divine artifact ranked Tree of Life, not even NPC powers would leave Zero Wing in peace, much less players. Everyone would do everything in their power to steal it. Even so, Shifeng was very satisfied with this outcome. The Tree of Life's bonus effects weren't his goal, but the items it would produce. He urgently needed both the Water of Life and the Nuclei of Life. The tree would also produce the Fruits of Life, which were godly tools for NPCs and players' development. Now, he just needed to wait for the Tree of Life to produce these items. With the matter of the Tree of Life resolved, Shifeng contacted Gentle Snow to ask, "Snow, how are the arrangements on your side coming along?" "Everyone's in position. After our discussion, we've set the entrance fee to 20 silver. Any player capable of exploring level 100 neutral maps is an expert, so they should be able to afford that price," Gentle Snow said. Even at 10 silver per person, Stone Forest City's player population had maxed out. Now that Stone Forest City was an intermediate city, not only had the mana density within its walls increased, but NPC trading firms' shops were also available. Hence, Gentle Snow and her subordinates had agreed that even if they doubled the entrance fee, Stone Forest City's player population might still skyrocket. The quests the NPC trading firms offered provided a significant portion of players' income, which was why so many experts insisted on keeping their base of operations in NPC cities. 20 silver. You guys are vicious. Shifeng was a little surprised to hear the new entrance fee. Moreover, based on the woman's expression, she must still consider the price a little low. Revealing a bitter smile, Shifeng continued, "That seems fair, but we are trying to develop Zero Wing as quickly as possible, and to do that, we'll need to attract as many experts to the city as we can. Normally, expert players have their own private teams, which include players of low standards. If those players cannot survive in Stone Forest City, their expert friends will go elsewhere." Stone Forest City was much larger than it had been, and it would even have plenty of room to spare if 7 or 8 million players visited. They no longer had to limit access to experts to develop the city. The more players within the city, the more prosperous it would become. In turn, more NPCs would visit, particularly those of other races. Furthermore, money was no longer a problem for the guild now that Zero Wing was capable of intercontinental travel. Rather than focus on money, they should try to grow Zero Wing's strength. Zero Wing wasn't nurturing as many Tier 3 players as it had been, and if they wished to attract more within a short time, they'd have to recruit more expert players. In that case, should we stick with 10 silver? Gentle Snow asked. After listening, she agreed with Shifeng's reasoning. Most of the city's previous visitors had been experts from the various guilds and members of powerful adventurer teams. Independent experts only made up a small minority of Stone Forest City's player population. However, she hadn't paid much attention to the matter since Stone Forest City had only been able to accommodate so many players. Now that mainstream players had reached level 100, it would be unwise to increase the city's entrance fee too much as they needed to recruit more players into Zero Wing and nurture more Tier 3 experts. No. Lower it to the minimum 5 silver, Shifeng decided. F5? Gentle Snow stuttered, stunned. Stone Forest City was now an intermediate city. Maintaining the original entrance fee would already be a major concession. She didn't even want to imagine what would become of the city if they lowered the entrance fee to 5 silver. Just set it to 5 silver, Shifeng said, nodding. It's about time we make some changes in Zero Wing. Read latest chapters at Wuxia World. Shifeng then instructed Gentle Snow to open the city to the public after adjusting the entrance fee. Meanwhile, the numerous independent and guild players outside of the city were growing impatient. They all shared their guesses about Stone Forest City's abrupt promotion. Is Zero Wing really going to make us wait outside for an entire day? I doubt it. There's too many of us out here. The entrance fees alone will be more than enough to make any power jealous. How could Zero Wing possibly pass on so much money? Huh? Look! Stone Forest City is open. Chapter 2553, Shocking Stone Forest City in Cold Spring Forest's inner area. A 100-man team of superbly equipped, level 107 plus experts ate up the ground as it followed the forested path towards Stone Forest City. The weakest of the team's mounts was Secret Silver rank, and as the team boldly flew down the small path, all players in their way stepped aside, none daring to hinder the team's advance. Even the various major powers members moved aside. Players didn't just move out of the expert team's way because of their imposing auras, but because of the guild emblem these players wore. It was Crimson Emperor's emblem, and not even God's domain's major powers could afford to offend the guild. Remember what the Grand Elders told you, Illusory. You are not to act unnecessarily. Once we're in Stone Forest City, the fierce man riding a six-clawed war bear and leading Crimson Emperor's main force warned Illusory words, who had been silent during their entire journey. Although he didn't know what made her think Zero Wing could stop Demon's Heart's assault, the guild's word was law. If Illusory words leaked any information to Zero Wing, and the various powers or Demon's Heart discovered it, she would put their guild in a very awkward position. I at least have that much common sense. I'm only going to take a look. You don't need to worry, Illusory words said, chuckling. Personally, she didn't think Zero Wing stood much of a chance against the various superpowers and Demon's Heart. She only thought the guild wouldn't go down so easily. She simply wanted to visit Stone Forest City to verify her assumption. When the two fell silent, a tall, beautiful female swordsman with short hair rode forward and matched paces with Illusory Word's mount. Unlike the other experts on the team, she wasn't wearing Crimson Emperor's guild emblem. Are you sure it's alright to take us with you, Vice Guild Leader Illusory? The short-haired woman asked. If Sure Feng were present, he'd be quite surprised. This short-haired swordsman was none other than Graceful Monarch from the Dark Den's Extreme Light Shelter. Relax. We're just going to take a look. We're not conducting some secret operation. Now that the Extreme Light Shelter and Crimson Emperor are allies, it's only a matter of time before you'll start developing on the main continent. It's best that you view the situation with your own eyes. Cold Spring Forest will likely become one of the main battlegrounds between regular players like us and dark players, and there are quite a few superpowers in Stone Forest City right now. Such a grand occasion doesn't happen every day, Illusory Words said, smiling. I can rest easy, then, Graceful Monarch said, nodding and breathing a sigh of relief. By now, she understood how insignificant the Dark Den was in God's domain, and after witnessing Crimson Emperor's residence, she realized what it meant to be a true superpower. Purple Rakshasa's description of superpowers had been an understatement. Before the various superpowers, the Extreme Light Shelter was nothing. It didn't even come close to rivaling first-rate powers. She was already quite fortunate that Crimson Emperor had wanted to ally with the Extreme Light Shelter. Monarch, I told you that big sis Illusory is a very nice person. It's all thanks to her that I improved so quickly. Since she's agreed to bring you and your team along on this trip, you'll definitely grow a lot stronger. The other shelter's experts might not even be a problem for you once you return to the Dark Den, Purple Rakshasa whispered, smiling as Graceful Monarch nervously fidgeted even after Illusory Words' reassurance. Our visit to the main continent has certainly been full of surprises. I had never thought the guild Blue Frost belongs to would be so powerful. Not only did Zero Wing slay troubled times, but it has also forced Demon's Heart to use its trump card, Graceful Monarch whispered back. She didn't know exactly how formidable Zero Wing was, but the fact that the guild had accomplished such feats meant that Shelter 1 wouldn't have to worry about its future. Zero Wing is indeed amazing, but it is only a pseudo-superpower right now. It still doesn't compare to Crimson Emperor. Since the Extreme Light Shelter and Crimson Emperor have entered a partnership, you won't have to worry about the shelter's development, Purple Rakshasa said. She knew what her companion was thinking. Chuckling, she continued, Zero Wing is about to face every player in a major otherworld. Even if it isn't annihilated, those players will at least partially cripple the guild. Shelter 1's development will likely become a problem. With the threat of destruction looming over Stone Forest City, Zero Wing wouldn't likely be able to help Shelter 1 in the future. In contrast, the Extreme Light Shelter had Crimson Emperor's help. Becoming one of the Dark Den's top 3 shelters should be entirely possible. While Graceful Monarch and Purple Rakshasa continued their conversation in whispered tones, the team left the forest that surrounded Stone Forest City. Stone Forest City lies ahead. Be careful once you enter the city. Many superpowers have hidden their forces within. If you accidentally offend one of them, we'll have trouble to deal with. Illusory words warned the two from the Dark Den. Zero Wing's main headquarters is ahead of us? Curiosity flashed in Graceful Monarch's eyes. I'll finally get a look at how strong the guild behind Blue Frost is. She still hadn't forgotten the image of Shifeng stopping the Demon King's hand in the Dark Den, and it piqued her not long after Illusory Word's warning. The silhouette of a gigantic city came into view. It was just as splendorous as the major NPC cities in the Ten Saints Empire. The mana density radiating from Stone Forest City was especially noticeable. The team felt as if they were gazing at a mountain of magic crystals, rather than a simple guild city. So, this is Zero Wing's guild city. Graceful Monarch was momentarily stupefied when she saw the city that brimmed with mana ahead. She had seen plenty of major NPC cities in the Ten Saints Empire. Although these major NPC cities were spectacular and mighty, they paled in comparison to Stone Forest City, and the Extreme Light Shelter was no more than a grass hut in comparison. Even Illusory Words gaped at the scene. Read latest chapters at Wuxia World. This wasn't her first visit to Stone Forest City. She had actually traveled to the city multiple times before, but she had no explanation for the view before her. Not only had Stone Forest City become as large and grand as major NPC cities, but it also emitted waves of dense mana, which players could even feel from several thousand yards away. How was this the Stone Forest City she knew? This was practically a holy city hidden in Cold Spring Forest. Illusory Words also spotted a massive line of players waiting outside of Stone Forest City's main entrance. At a glance, there were easily several 100,000 players waiting to enter the city, and as time passed, the number grew. She even spotted quite a few players selling their spots in line. Moreover, Illusory Words noticed plenty of NPCs in line, even those from other races. Stone Forest City now looked more like a well-established, major NPC city, not a guild city. The fierce man beside her glanced Illusory Words' way and asked, "Did you lead us to the wrong place, Illusory?" Chapter 2554, Zero Wing's Trump Card. With the fierce man's question hanging in the air, the rest of Crimson Emperor's members turned to Illusory Words. The Stone Forest City before them was simply too impressive. It was hard to imagine this was merely an intermediate city. They had been busy within the Ten Saints Empire, so they had only heard about Stone Forest City. This was their first visit. Only Illusory Words, who preferred to wander throughout God's domain, had ever seen the city before. These are the coordinates. This should be Stone Forest City, Illusory Words said, giving the fierce man a bitter smile. The sign above the gate clearly states this is the city we're looking for. This shouldn't be a mistake. In truth, even after seeing the sign, she felt as if she had arrived at the wrong place. This looked nothing like the Stone Forest City she had visited in the past. It almost looked like a major NPC city. Furthermore, there was too much mana wafting from the city. Not even the holy city of Titan had such dense mana. Stone Forest City looked nothing like a player-owned city. Crimson Emperor's members snapped out of their daze and examined the city before them. Just as Illusory Words had said, this was undoubtedly Stone Forest City. Crimson Emperor's members weren't the only players shocked by Stone Forest City's new appearance. Some of the various major powers experts that had come to investigate the upgraded city were just as astonished by what they found. No one had ever thought a guild city would change so drastically when it grew from a basic city to intermediate rank. Black Flame really is amazing. With so much mana in the city, players will still choose to rest here, even with the Dark World's imminent invasion. With the entry fees alone, Zero Wing won't have any financial worries for a while. Galaxy Past, the Star Alliance's guild leader, enviously commented as he gazed in awe at the splendorous city before him. Once upon a time in Starmoon Kingdom, the Star Alliance had stood toe-to-toe with Zero Wing. However, while the Star Alliance had been nursing headaches over its daily income, Zero Wing was swimming in money. Nowadays, the various guilds' main source of income was the entrance fees they collected in their guild towns and cities, but as more towns and cities rose up in neutral maps, the competition between them grew intense. To maintain an edge over their competition, most guild towns and cities had reduced their entrance fees to a painful low. Stone Forest City, on the other hand, wouldn't have such worries. As the sole guild city in a level 100 neutral map, it had no competition whatsoever. It could set whatever entrance fee it wished, and plenty of players would still visit the city. That's for sure. Zero Wing will make a killing. You've just arrived, so you might not realize how insane the guild is, but Zero Wing is only charging 5 silver per person to enter the city. I've heard that it's the lowest price you can set for an intermediate city. Other guild cities in neutral maps charge at least 2 silver per person, but they're nothing compared to Stone Forest City. Many of my friends are planning to shift their base of operations to Stone Forest City, and I'm sure they're not alone in that idea. I suspect we'll see the number of players trying to get an increase by at least tenfold, an independent Tier 3 shield warrior in front of Galaxy Past in line said, nodding in agreement. 5 silver. Flourishing Willow, the Tier 3 female ranger behind Galaxy Past, stared at the shield warrior with wide, shocked eyes, doubting his claim. First-rate guilds like the Star Alliance had no choice but to reduce their entrance fees due to how much competition they faced, but Stone Forest City was unique. Even if it cost 20 silver to enter the city, a ton of players would still use it as their bases, let alone 10 silver. God's Domain had far too many players and innumerable experts. Stone Forest City wasn't nearly large enough to accommodate so many players. With a guild city's limited capacity and the fact that Zero Wing wouldn't have to worry about customers, increasing the entrance fee was the wisest decision, yet Zero Wing had done the opposite. Flourishing Willow simply couldn't believe it. Even Crimson Emperor's members, who had just found a place in line, were astonished when they learned about the city's cheap entrance fee. Charging anything less than 20 silver would be an insult to such a sacred resting ground as Stone Forest City in their opinions. They had even been prepared to pay 30 silver per person to enter the city. Not only would the city's incredibly dense mana help players rapidly recover from exhaustion, but players would also see astounding results if they trained within the city. 30 silver was more than worth such benefits for experts like them. So, what was the point of lowering the entrance fee to 5 silver? So, this is Black Flame's trump card. It certainly is a wise move, the fierce man from Crimson Emperor muttered, overhearing the Star Alliance's conversations. Had Zero Wing set Stone Forest City's entrance fee at 20 or 30 silver per person, there wouldn't be as many players interested in living in the city. Although the city would eventually become overcrowded, it would take some time. Not all players could afford such a high price, after all. In contrast, even ordinary level 100+ players could afford 5 silver, and they made up the majority of God's Domain's player base. With such a low entrance fee, the city's player population would reach its limit in 2 or 3 days. Even at 5 silver per person, the city would generate amazing profits. This is going to give Demon's Heart's Flaming Light a huge headache. Zero Wing can easily earn over 1 million gold in the next 2 or 3 days. Including the profits it earns from the businesses within the city, the guild will earn a minimum of 2 million gold before 3 days pass. With so much money, Zero Wing can easily survive the Dark World's assault for a very long time, Illusory Words said, smiling. Even after seeing the city's glorious transformation, she hadn't thought highly of Zero Wing's chances, but after this discovery, she recognized that the guild had exceeded her expectations. Now, Demon's Heart would have a much harder time threatening Zero Wing. Zero Wing has indeed made a smart move. Unfortunately, it is too late, the fierce man said, shaking his head. What do you mean? Illusory Words asked strangely. I didn't tell you this earlier, but the Grand Elders have secured detailed information regarding Demon's Heart's movements. The Dark World's portal will activate tomorrow at the latest, and the Dark World's various powers and independent experts will surge into Cold Spring Forest, the fierce man said in a whisper to illusory words. Zero Wing simply doesn't have enough time to collect the wealth it requires. Stone Forest City was quite attractive, especially to ordinary players, but it would take time for ordinary players to learn of the city's perks. Moreover, ordinary players didn't travel via teleportation like experts. They generally moved between countries by airship, which was much cheaper. To make matters worse, there weren't any air routes to Stone Forest City, so players would have to make the rest of the trip on their mounts. Unlike Crimson Emperor's experts, ordinary level 100 players generally had common mounts. Factoring in other aspects, such as the spread of information, the war between Zero Wing and the Dark World's forces would have begun long before ordinary players started to visit the city from the various kingdoms and empires. While the new Stone Forest City astonished the various powers, Shifeng had secretly teleported back to White River City to upgrade his Night Division. While expert players served as a guild's foundation in God's domain, a guild needed a strong Night Division if it wished to set roots down in level 100+ neutral maps. Since Shifeng had previously lacked the necessary funds, he had refrained from upgrading his Night Division. However, money was no longer a problem. With the profits from selling the Western Continent's materials and Stone Forest City's entrance fees, he now had a total of 5 million gold sitting in his bag. Holding on to all this money would be a huge waste, especially now that Stone Forest City was the first intermediate city in a level 100 neutral map. He could definitely recruit plenty of knights with high growth potential. 4. Read latest chapters at Wuxia World. EU Starmoon Kingdom, White River City's Adventurers Association. News of Stone Forest City's upgrade had already reached the masses, and practically every player in the Adventurers Association was discussing the matter when Shifeng arrived. Many independent players expressed their eager intentions to develop near the city, particularly those with their own fixed parties or teams. Nodding in satisfaction, Shifeng climbed the stairs to the Adventurers Association's second floor and entered one of the VIP rooms. Lord Bronze Legatee, how may I be of service? Senior Administrator Lorraine asked, smiling as she walked up to him. I wish to see the current recruitment status and promotion list for my Night Division, Shifeng informed her with a grin. Chapter 2555, All New Night Division. Lorraine nodded to Shifeng's request and promptly left to retrieve the relevant information. After a short moment, the senior administrator returned with a thick book, placing it on the table before him. There's so many. Shifeng asked, glancing down at the tome. Lorraine had only given him a sheet of paper during his last visit when he had requested to see his Night Division's recruitment status, yet now, she had an entire book for him. Normally, if there were fewer than 30,000 applicants, players would only be given a sheet of paper. They'd receive another sheet for every 10,000 applicants beyond that and would only receive a complete book once more than 100,000 NPCs applied for their Night Division. Shifeng had already recruited NPCs from many NPC cities, and could reasonably assume he had accepted or rejected most interested NPCs. Hence, he shouldn't see too many more new applications. Receiving another 50,000 would be a miracle, and yet, more than 100,000 new NPCs had applied. Initially, Lord Bronze Legatee, you hadn't received many applicants. However, due to the large number of other races visiting Stone Forest City, the number of interested individuals has considerably increased, Lorraine explained. The Freedom City title's benefits have taken effect so soon. The explanation stunned Shifeng. He had thought he'd have to wait a few more days before the title took effect. He had just promoted Stone Forest City and assumed the system would make him wait. However, it seemed that he had somewhat underestimated the new title. A total of 112,672 people have applied to serve as your knights. Among them, 83,241 are human, 27,412 are Orcish, 1,836 are Elven, and 183 are Giants. This book has the records of all of these applicants' information, Lorraine continued, ignoring Shifeng's muttering. Nearly 30,000 NPCs from other races? If the superpowers of the past found out about this, wouldn't they go mad? Sherfeng could not help his growing excitement. Recruiting NPCs from other races for their night divisions was incredibly difficult for players. The other races had smaller populations than humans. Normally, the various superpowers would be overjoyed if even several thousand non-human NPCs applied to serve as knights. And yet, Sherfeng had nearly 30,000 of these applicants, certainly a frightening number. Not even a 2-star lord might receive so many throughout a full year. Most importantly, elves and giants had applied in considerably large numbers. The situation had completely exceeded his expectations. In God's domain, the Orcish population was only second to the humans. Ors typically made up the majority of non-human NPC applicants. Of course, that didn't discount Or Knight's strength. On the contrary, Or NPCs were quite powerful. They were natural-born warriors with sharp senses and robust frames that were far superior to humans. Excluding heroes, human fighters were no match for Or fighters of the same level and tier. The human race's superior research and creativity were the reason that Ors weren't a match for humans and forced to live far from the main continent's fertile lands. However, if one could assemble the Ors scattered across the continent and form a melee unit, the force would be absolutely unstoppable in battle. Shaking off his shock, Sherfeng immediately inspected the recruitment list. When he had arrived, he had only planned to recruit new knights with high growth potential to replace some of his weaker NPCs, but now, he had many more changes to make to his knight division. Time flew by, and without taking a break, Sherfeng had spent over 20 hours browsing the recruitment list. He was more focused on the list than he was during boss fights. Thankfully, I brought plenty of coins with me. Otherwise, I wouldn't even have enough to pay the dismissal fees. Sherfeng revealed a bitter smile as he finished reading the list. If things had gone according to his original plan, he would have only been able to replace a small fraction of his Knight Division's members, but now that he could recruit non-human NPCs, which would be bound to him for life, things had changed. Once he recruited non-human NPCs, he couldn't dismiss or replace them. Hence, he had to be extremely careful when choosing non-human knights. Fortunately, non-human NPCs were much cheaper to recruit and maintain than human NPCs. They were generally 30% cheaper. All things considered, it wasn't a bad transaction. Moreover, non-human NPCs tended to be quite talented. In fact, more than half of the non-human NPCs in God's domain were Bronze Knight standard or above, which was one of the reasons that the various powers of the past had preferred non-human NPCs. Of the 27,412 Ors that had applied to join Sherfeng's Knight Division, 15,123 were Tier 2 Bronze Knights. The ratio was unheard of among human NPCs. However, it was quite normal with Ors. Many Tier 3 Ors had also sent in applications, and they all had considerably high potential. Even the weakest among them was at the Mysterious Iron Standard, while 45 were at the Secret Silver Standard, and 1 Fine Gold Standard or had applied. The Elven and Giant applicants were just as shocking. Elves were natural-born mages, with higher growth potential than most races. Even the weakest elf that applied was Bronze rank, while as many as 43 were Secret Silver rank, and 2 were Fine Gold rank. Moreover, every elf applicant was Tier 3. Although giants made up the majority of applicants, with only 183, 13 were Tier 3 Secret Silver Knights, and 1 was a Tier 3 Fine Gold Knight. More than 100 Secret Silver and Fine Gold ranked non-human NPCs had applied to Sherfeng's Knight Division, many times more than those among the 80,000 plus human applicants. Lord Bronze Legatee, have you made your decision? Lorraine asked when Sherfeng closed the book. Permission. I want all knights with Secret Silver potential and above. I also want these Mysterious Iron Knights with high growth potential and the remaining Tier 3 Knights, Sherfeng replied, nodding. Normally, an NPC Knight needed at least Mysterious Iron growth potential before they could be promoted to Tier 3. Even in the later stages of God's domain, Tier 3 NPCs would be considered a powerful force. After all, very few players could reach Tier 4. Even if they did, a group of Tier 3 NPCs, backed by a city's magic array, wouldn't be an easy opponent. If enough Tier 3 NPCs formed a battle array, they could slay Tier 4 players. This was why, even after reaching Tier 4, players could only afford to act conceited in the fields. Very well. There are 152 applicants with secret silver potential or above. Including the rest, there are a total of 326 Tier 3 knights. Calculating the recruitment fee of the 1,872 Tier 3 Mysterious Iron Knights with high potential and some of your current knights' dismissal fees, your bill comes to 554,600 gold, Lorraine explained after taking a moment to tally his total. Please, include the promotion fees for the 437 members of my knight division, Shifeng said. Giving the matter some thought, he continued, I also want to outfit my Tier 3 knights with epic equipment. How much will that come to? That will raise the price considerably. If we include the 437 people that will be promoted to Tier 3, you will need an additional 5,640,000 gold to arm all of your Tier 3 knights with epic equipment. With the prior fees, your total comes to 6,198,970 gold, Lorraine responded, giving Shifeng a skeptical look. After giving the matter some more thought, Shifeng said, reduce the number slightly, then. I'll take 1,150 sets. That won't be a problem. Your total will be 5,158,970 gold. Once we process the payment, the merchandise will be delivered within 3 hours. The new knights will arrive at your city lord's mansion within 1 hour, Lorraine calmly stated. Shifeng then nearly emptied his bag of coins, and in the blink of an eye, he was once again a pauper. Nurturing a knight division really is expensive. It's no wonder why all of the superpowers that had knight divisions were poor, Shifeng muttered, bitterly smiling at the less than 3,000 gold in his bag. While Shifeng upgraded his knight division, in a remote canyon in the distant Cold Spring Forest. A group of black-clad magical class players chanted an incantation along the edge of a gigantic magic array. The array covered a 200-yard radius, and in its center stood an indifferent, handsome youth with a night-black crystal in his left hand, while writing a series of divine runes with his right. With each line of completed runes, a shard broke off of the crystal and disintegrated. Read latest chapters at Wuxia World. When the crystal was nearly gone, the youth completed the final line of divine runes. Suddenly, the sky above the magic array split, and a colossal door dropped from the spatial tear. The door was over 100 meters tall and covered in ancient runes, radiating a mighty aura that made everyone nearby shudder. Once the door landed, it began to part down the middle. Excellent! It's complete! Flaming Light exclaimed as the door began to open. He then glanced at the middle-aged man standing nearby and said, Heart, notify the various powers and tell them that the door is open. Whether they cherish this opportunity or not is up to them. Understood. Furious Heart respectfully responded, crossing the threshold with his team. Chapter 2556, Crazy Freedom Hotel Cold Spring Forest, Stone Forest City. As news regarding Stone Forest City spread to more independent players, the number of small adventurer teams visiting the city continued to increase. Less than a day after the city's reopening, it had become somewhat crowded, and even more players had lined up to enter the city. A 6-man party of cloaked players, all radiating darkness energy, stood among the long line, and none of the nearby players even dared to take half a step closer to them. Those players' killing intent is so strong. Not even dark players, who constantly slaughter others in the fields, have such intense hostility. Who are those people? Their killing intent isn't the only thing that's intense. Look at their equipment. They might have concealed the glow effect, but all of their items are engraved with magic runes. Their equipment should be fine gold rank or higher. Level 105 fine gold equipment. Not even the various superpowers main force members necessarily have such top-tier items. Although the independent players nearby were afraid of the 6-man party, they couldn't help but envy the party's equipment. Ever since mainstream players had reached level 100, demand for level 100 plus secret silver weapons and equipment had skyrocketed, but supply remained incredibly low. Thus, these items' prices had substantially increased. Not even ordinary expert players could afford level 100 plus fine gold weapons or equipment. Even the various superpowers main force members would throw a party if they acquired just one such weapon or equipment piece. However, the weakest piece the six-man party wore was level 105 fine gold rank, and all of their equipment bore magic runes. To ordinary players, the equipment was divine. Despite noticing the surrounding players' envious looks, the members of the six-man party didn't respond. I guess the main continent's ordinary experts don't amount to much. Not only do they have such poor weapons and equipment, but they don't even know about magic enhancement. Once the army has gathered, the Dark World will likely claim this area as new territory in the blink of an eye. A grey-clad, Tier 3 Cursmancer with a military haircut disdainfully dismissed as he glanced at the independent experts around him. You shouldn't say such things, old Flash. After all, the environment in this area is no match for what we have in the Dark World. These players only have to worry about monsters in the fields, while we are always on the lookout for monster and player ambushes. It's only natural that our world's players have developed so much faster, a middle-aged, bearded man with simple features chided, chuckling. Besides, ordinary experts are just that. The various major powers experts are much stronger. Otherwise, our two guilds wouldn't have signed a non-interference pact with Zero Wing. I guess, but I still don't get why our guilds wanted to partner with Zero Wing in the first place. You must have seen how powerful that army was on our way here. How could Zero Wing possibly stop that kind of force? We shouldn't have a reason to pay Zero Wing 500,000 darkness crystals, the Cursmancer named Magic Flash grumbled. 500,000 darkness crystals was no small price, even to their guilds. They certainly weren't worth a non-interference agreement from Zero Wing in their fight for resources in Cold Spring Forest. The only thing Zero Wing could do when facing the Dark World's countless players was hold inside the city. I don't know, but the higher-ups have their own reasons. We just need to complete the task they've assigned us, the middle-aged man said, shaking his head. In all honesty, the situation confused him, too. The number of Dark World players preparing to invade Cold Spring Forest was no laughing matter. Several million players had already joined the invading army, and more were on their way. News of the open pathway had just begun to spread, and it would take time for the information to reach the far corners of the Dark World. Based on their guild's estimates, the army should easily include tens of millions of players, possibly over 100 million. Not even the neighboring kingdoms and empires stood a chance against such a force, much less Zero Wing. The Dark World's army would definitely cause a massive commotion when it arrived on the main continent. While Dark Rhapsody and Deity Society's members conversed, they crossed Stone Forest City's gates. The mana here sure is dense. If Dark Rhapsody's guild cities had this much mana, we'd easily become the #1 guild in the Dark World, Magic Flash noticed, envious when he felt the mesmerizing mana in the air. It is certainly astonishing. It's no wonder why so many superpowers want this city, the bearded middle-aged man replied. What a pity. If Demon's Heart hadn't opened the Dark World's portal in Cold Spring Forest, Zero Wing might have become a massive threat to the various superpowers, Magic Flash said, glancing around at the crowd of players and NPC merchants. Seeing so many people, he, more or less, understood why his superiors had decided to ally with Zero Wing. Stone Forest City was no less prosperous than major NPC cities. With a guild city like this under its control, Zero Wing would have no worries about its development. Since Cold Spring Forest was a level 100 neutral map, every player here had a certain degree of strength. Including the conveniences the city offered, not only could Zero Wing continue to recruit and nurture more expert players, but its members' average levels would gradually surpass the various superpowers, as well. Zero Wing definitely had the potential to become a titan in God's domain. Maybe, but we shouldn't dwell on it. We should hurry and contact Zero Wing. The sooner we get this done, the sooner we can return. If we wait and miss the invasion, it'll become more difficult to establish ourselves in Cold Spring Forest later, the middle-aged man cautioned. I've already contacted the guild. They said we should head toward the tallest building on the main street. Once we're there, someone will take us to meet their guild leader, Magic Flash said. You mean that building? The middle-aged man asked, pointing to the Freedom Hotel in the center of the city. Astonished, he continued, I'm impressed that Zero Wing managed to erect such a tall building. The tallest building either of our guilds has constructed is only a little over 50 meters tall, but that thing is at least 150. So what if it's tall? Someone is still going to take it from them, Magic Flash growled, sneering. The middle-aged man didn't try to refute Magic Flash's assumption. Such a tall building would only be useful for visual impact. Zero Wing would have been far better off spending its money to strengthen its members, in his opinion. Strength meant everything in God's domain. The cloaked players then made their way toward the hotel. They didn't take long to reach it, and when they did, they noticed a long line of players both inside and outside of the Freedom Hotel. Many of the players in line were Tier 3 experts, and some of their auras even made Magic Flash and his companions shudder with fear. There were dozens of those experts, too. Even more surprising, every one of those experts obediently stood in line before the Freedom Hotel's front desk. The scene stupefied Magic Flash and his party. Normally, such experts could act as vice-commanders, even commanders, of their guild's legions. Players of their caliber warranted respect, regardless of where they were, yet they waited in line with a bunch of ordinary players. What was happening here? Moreover, Magic Flash's party was confused by the fact that every one of those experts, including the peak experts, seemed excited and grateful to receive one of the Freedom Hotel's room tokens from the front desk. Suddenly, Gentle Snow approached the cloaked party, asking, Are you representatives from Dark Rhapsody and Deity Society? That's right, we are, the middle-aged man confirmed, nodding as he spotted the Zero Wing emblem Gentle Snow wore. He was more than a little surprised when he sensed Gentle Snow's powerful aura. In that case, please, follow me. Our guild leader is waiting in the reception room upstairs, Gentle Snow said after verifying the party's identity. She then led the party to the elevator that would take them to the appropriate floor. Many of the experts waiting for their room tokens were jealous as they watched Magic Flash's party follow Gentle Snow. Crap. Who are those people? They actually get to use the elevator that'll take them to the 80th floor and beyond. They must be Zero Wing's allies. If I remember correctly, only the hotel's silver members get to stay on those floors. You need more than just coins and magic crystals to become a silver member, too. You also need to earn a large number of membership points. I've heard that not even top adventurer teams' commanders were granted silver memberships. Zero Wing is too stingy. It actually wants us to earn points just to stay in this hotel. I wonder when I'll earn enough to become a silver member. It's not all that unusual. There are only a limited number of rooms available, after all, and I've heard that the advanced rooms on the 80th floor and above are amazing. Not only is the recovery speed there 30% higher than in normal rooms, but each room also has its own training room. Players can practice simple combat techniques by themselves in those training rooms. Seriously? You can actually practice your combat skills in the advanced rooms? This won't do. I need to become a silver member as soon as possible. The players waiting in the Freedom Hotel's lobby were indescribably jealous as they watched Magic Flash's party enter the elevator. Their reactions confused the dark players. A short moment later, the group arrived on the Freedom Hotel's top floor. Read latest chapters at Wuxia World. The instant Magic Flash and the others set foot on the Freedom Hotel's top floor, their minds felt serene. To be precise, they felt mentally refreshed as if their thoughts had found their own unique paths. They could now conceptualize ideas without confusion. So, this is Zero Wing. Magic Flash and the others couldn't help but gasp when they felt the change. They had already been astonished by the Freedom Hotel's mana, but compared to this environment, the lobby was nothing. If they could train on this floor, they'd see results dozens of times faster. They might even be able to break into the Void Realm. Our guild leader is inside. Please, go in, Gentle Snow said, not surprised in the slightest to see the 6 players' astonished expressions. She simply smiled as she opened the reception room's doors. Chapter 2557, Astonishing Foundation's gentle snows request yanked Magic Flash and the others from their reverie, and they walked into the VIP reception room with awkward expressions. As they entered the room, however, they were, once again, left speechless. The refreshed sensation they had enjoyed in the hall had been amazing, but it was amplified several times the moment they set foot in the reception room. The strange energy in the room was clearly denser than in the hall. If they could train inside this reception room for a few days, their combat standards would reach the next level. Even the various powers would treat a room like this like a sacred training ground, barring entry to anyone other than core members, and yet, Zero Wing used it as a reception room. Extravagance. This was too extravagant. A male swordsman reclined on one of the sofas in the reception room, wearing a simple set of equipment and a black cloak across his back. Opposite of the swordsman was a woman who had barely reached level 100. The woman radiated no aura whatsoever and looked even weaker than ordinary players. However, the advanced Master Forger's insignia the woman wore was extraordinarily eye-catching. The woman was none other than Melancholic Smile, who had been busy managing the candlelight trading firm. After long hours of crafting and frantic research, she had successfully become an advanced Master Forger, as well. Guild leader, this is our current limit. The forging techniques involved are simply too delicate and complex. Crafting a successful product in a short time is impossible, I'm afraid, Melancholic Smile disappointedly insisted as she placed several pieces of equipment on the table between her and Shifeng. The moment she did, Magic Flash and the others' eyes widened in shock. Not only were the several equipment pieces part of the same set, but they also carried the glow of fine gold equipment. In other words, the equipment placed on the table was a fine gold set equipment. Moreover, it was a level 100 plus fine gold set equipment. Even Dark Rhapsody and Deity Society had only found a few sets, yet Zero Wing could craft it, and based on Melancholic Smile's comment, that was a failed product. Meanwhile, as Magic Flash's party entered the reception room, Shifeng's gaze shifted to his guests. You must be Dark Rhapsody and Deity Society's representatives. Please, have a seat, Shifeng said. When he noticed that Magic Flash's group couldn't pull their eyes from the failed items on the table, he chuckled and said, It seems you are very interested in this Dark Demon set. After returning to Stone Forest City, he had immediately instructed Gentle Snow to pass the Dark Demon set forging design to Melancholic Smile for research and production. He had enough responsibilities at the moment and didn't have the time to forge the set equipment himself. In contrast, Melancholic Smile could and did devote her free time to forging. Hence, she improved her skills a lot faster than Shifeng could. She had even become an advanced master forger before he had. The candlelight trading firm also had Cream Cocoa, who focused all of her time on forging since she didn't have any management duties as Melancholic Smile did. She improved even faster than Melancholic Smile and had become the first advanced master forger in Candlelight. Now, the trading firm had two. Unfortunately, the Dark Demon set proved far more difficult to produce than Shifeng had expected, and even after working together, Cream Cocoa and Melancholic Smile had barely managed to craft one fine gold set. Moreover, their production success rate wasn't particularly high. Even after involving all sorts of tools and rare materials, they had only managed to raise their success rate to 50%. I apologize for our earlier rude behavior, the bearded middle-aged man from Deity Society hurriedly apologized. It's just that level 100 plus fine gold set equipment is a truly rare sight. I had never imagined that Zero Wing was capable of crafting such equipment. It surprised me, but rest assured, we won't reveal this secret to anyone. It's fine. This doesn't need to be a secret. Since Dark Rhapsody, Deity Society, and Zero Wing are allies, you don't need to behave like outsiders. If you are interested, I can sell you a few sets, Shifeng nonchalantly offered. Zero Wing's possession of the Dark Demon set forging design had already been exposed. Only, news of it hadn't reached the Eastern continent. Hence, there was no need to keep it a secret. Moreover, Shifeng intended to store these fine gold-ranked Dark Demon sets in the guild warehouse, making them available for purchase later. Once he did, there would be no containing the information. Besides, the sooner the public learned about the Dark Demon set, the better. That way, Zero Wing could use the set to attract more experts to join the guild. Are you serious, guild leader Black Flame? Magic Flash could not help but ask. That was a level 100 plus fine gold set equipment they were talking about. If he could get his hands on such a set, his combat power would increase by at least 30%. He might even catch up to peak experts of the same level. Of course, Shifeng said, smiling when he saw the passionate light in Magic Flash's gaze. However, it won't be cheap, and I won't sell them for coins. He did not mind selling the fine gold ranked Dark Demon set. This was only a failed product, after all, and at this point, most superpowers had at least a few sets of fine gold set equipment. Selling some to Zero Wing's partners wouldn't harm his guild in any way. What do you want for the set, then? Magic Flash eagerly asked. Darkness crystals, Shifeng said. My price isn't very high. What do you think of 15,000 crystals? The various powers still thought only dark players needed darkness crystals, but they didn't realize that as God's Domain's lifestyle players continued to develop, attributed magic crystals would become more valuable. Weapons and equipment crafted with attributed magic crystals would gain additional properties related to the crystals. Such changes wouldn't be visible in the item's attribute panel, but in the hands of Tier 3 players and above, they'd perform considerably better, especially for players with fully unlocked mana bodies. Fortunately, darkness crystals were relatively easy to acquire in the dark world. Hence, Shifeng had decided to collect some before the various powers realized their value. 15,000 crystals per set. Magic Flash was shocked. Isn't that a little too much? Guild leader Black Flame, level 100 plus fine gold set equipment was indeed very rare and some of the best equipment available in God's Domain right now, but darkness crystals were similarly rare and valuable. In fact, they were worth even more than magic crystals to dark players. Guild leader Black Flame, is what you say really true? The bearded middle-aged man suddenly interrupted. Ha! Why would I lie? I want 15,000 darkness crystals per set. If you wish to buy them, you may do so whenever you wish, Shifeng said. He could not help but feel a little exasperated at the middle-aged man's question. Before Magic Flash could refuse the offer, the middle-aged man from Deity Society continued. Deity Society will buy them. We'll buy as many sets as you're willing to sell us, the older man declared, determined. Have you gone insane, Old Forest? Magic Flash was astonished. What a joke. The Dark Demon set was just a level 100 plus fine gold set equipment. 15,000 darkness crystals would be the maximum anyone would pay for such a set, yet his companion jumped at the chance to buy them. Magic Flash couldn't think of any sane reason why he'd act like this. Read latest chapters at Wuxia World. Wait. Something's not right. Magic Flash realized something felt off when he saw the bearded man's nonchalant reaction. He immediately activated his identification skill and turned to the Dark Demon set on the table. Both Dark Rhapsody and Deity Society had sent players with advanced identification skills to lead their respective groups as insurance. While Magic Flash led Dark Rhapsody's team, Deity Society's leader for this party was Old Forest. There had to be a problem for Old Forest to act like this. Don't bother with an appraisal, Old Flash. The fine gold set equipment on the table isn't some level 105 set. It's a top-tier fine gold set equipment that players can use until level 120. No one had ever found anything like it in the dark world, Old Forest whispered as Magic Flash used his own advanced identification skill. Chapter 2558, Wildly Arrogant Zero Wing. Upon hearing Old Forest's words, Magic Flash gasped. Fine gold set equipment that can be used up to level 120. Currently, the best-known fine gold set equipment in the dark world could be used only up to level 105. Even Dark Rhapsody's peak experts sported only level 105 dark gold equipment, which was the equivalent of level 110 fine gold equipment, hardly comparable to level 110 fine gold set equipment. Level 120 fine gold set equipment was simply unimaginable. That's right. Aside from level 100 plus epic equipment, there's no better equipment than this in the entire Dark World, Old Forest said, nodding as he tried to suppress the excitement in his heart. If the price was indeed 15,000 darkness crystals for level 120 fine gold set equipment, then it was definitely acceptable. This was especially true when the Dark World's various powers were frantically raiding level 100 team dungeons. Due to the abysmally low drop rate for level 100 plus weapons and equipment, these powers were not making any significant progress with their dungeon raids. This, in turn, led to a stagnation in their development. If he could secure a batch of Dark Demon sets for Divine Society, then his guild would have a massive advantage over the other guilds. With this advantage, they could easily earn back the cost of the Dark Demon sets. As soon as Old Forest finished speaking, excitement also shone in Magic Flash's eyes. Magic Flash immediately said, "Guild leader Black Flame, Dark Rhapsody will also buy everything you have. Darkness crystals definitely aren't a problem." If he could get his hands on multiple Dark Demon sets, then the plate armor classes of the guild's main force would be in for a wonderful time. They wouldn't have to worry about finding equipment before reaching level 125. Moreover, the main force would also have a much easier time raiding level 100 team dungeons. In fact, Dark Rhapsody might even become the first guild in the Dark World to clear a 100-man, level 100 team dungeon. The Dark Demon sets production is much more difficult than you think. I don't have many sets available. Even now, we have managed to produce only 4 sets, Shifeng said, chuckling at the longing expressions of the two people before him. Shifeng wished he could produce as many Dark Demon sets as he wanted. However, the Dark Demon set was actually level 110 to level 120 Dark Gold set equipment. The materials needed to produce it were extremely rare, which severely limited its production volume. Moreover, even when making the failed version of the Dark Demon set, the production success rate was only 50%. Only 4 sets. Magic Flash and Old Forest felt a little disappointed when they heard Shifeng's words. However, after giving the matter some thought, they found it reasonable. After all, this was level 120 fine gold set equipment they were talking about. If it were so easy to produce, Zero Wing would be invincible. Of course, it isn't exactly impossible if your two guilds wish to purchase them in large quantities, Shifeng said, smiling when he saw the disappointment on the two men's faces. Upon hearing Shifeng's words, Old Forest immediately understood what Shifeng was insinuating. Without hesitation, he replied, "Guild leader Black Flame, please state your conditions." "So long as they are within my authority, I can definitely agree to them on behalf of Deity Society. Just being able to purchase a few Dark Demon sets at 15,000 darkness crystals per set could already be considered a miracle, all the more so for purchasing a large batch of the sets. With a sufficiently large number of the sets, a guild could raise the overall strength of its main force by a large margin." Zero Wing was naturally under no obligation to give away such a wonderful opportunity to their two guilds. "It is the same for my side as well," Magic Flash said. If he missed out on such a windfall, his guild leader and the elders of the guild would beat him to death when he returned. On the other hand, if he succeeded in this negotiation, then he would make a huge contribution to the guild. Although the production of the Dark Demon set is difficult, manufacturing several sets a day is still feasible. Zero Wing is willing to supply these sets to your two guilds long-term, Shifeng said. However, I hope that your two guilds can help Zero Wing's candlelight trading firm establish itself in the Dark World's major NPC cities and guarantee the safety of its operation. Silence momentarily fell over the entire room after Shifeng finished speaking, as both Magic Flash and Old Forest looked at him in astonishment. They never thought that Zero Wing's guild leader had such enormous ambitions. The Dark World was equivalent to roughly 3 ordinary empires on the main continent. The other world's player population was larger than even that of the Fire Dragon Empire, one of the 4 great empires of God's domain. As the Dark World had been sealed all this time, it had almost no contact with the main continent whatsoever. Hence, the Dark World's various powers thoroughly monopolized the other world's NPC cities. Moreover, the NPC cities found in the Dark World were different from those found on the main continent in that players held partial authority over them, which made taking over the Dark World's NPC cities incredibly difficult for outside powers. Meanwhile, the opening of the Dark World's portal now presented both the Dark World's powers and the main continent's powers with a huge business opportunity. Needless to say, the main continent's various superpowers would definitely contest over this opportunity and would naturally be willing to offer unimaginable prices. Guild leader Black Flame, I'm afraid I don't have the authority to decide on such a matter, Old Forest stated honestly. Moreover, this matter involves a lot of interests. Even if Zero Wing is offering up the Dark Demon set, I do not believe my superiors will agree to your condition. As for Magic Flash, he inwardly rolled his eyes at Shifeng's demand. The Dark Demon set might be capable of further elevating the strength of their guild's main forces, but its value was nothing compared to the wealth of 3 empires worth of players. This was also one of the reasons why the various superpowers were avoiding hostilities with dark guilds, as doing so would mean losing a massive business opportunity. At this moment, let alone team leaders like Magic Flash and Old Forest, even the other 4 members of the party disdained Shifeng. Shifeng was actually trying to secure such a huge business opportunity by offering just a few sets of fine gold set equipment. Did he take them for fools? Read latest chapters at Wuxia World. Moreover, Zero Wing was already having problems keeping its position in Cold Spring Forest, yet Shifeng actually wanted to enter the Dark World's various NPC cities. This was a complete and utter joke. Don't be in such a rush to reject my offer. I understand that this involves a lot of benefits. I know even the Dark Demon set is insufficient to persuade your 2 guilds, Shifeng said, chuckling at the duo's reactions. However, what if I can make it so that the people of your 2 guilds can freely move between the Dark World and Cold Spring Forest, while everyone else from the Dark World cannot? Guild leader Black Flame, what do you mean? Old Forest asked, unable to grasp Shifeng's meaning. Guild leader Black Flame, you should know that the portal connecting the Dark World and the main continent has already been opened. The Dark World's players can come and go as they wish. This is something even Flaming Light, the holder of the portal's key, cannot stop. What can Zero Wing possibly do? Magic Light said, laughing. I don't know whether Flaming Light can stop those players or not, but from now onward, Zero Wing is taking ownership of the Dark World's portal in Cold Spring Forest. Shifeng said, smiling. He paid no attention to the ridicule Magic Flash and the others were displaying. Chapter 2559, Heading Toward the Dark World. Magic Flash and his companions stared at Shifeng in stunned silence. How arrogant! This swordsman was wildly arrogant. Not even the main continent's super guilds would dare spout such nonsense. They were talking about all of the players in an entire otherworld, and not just any ordinary otherworld, but one subjected to cruel competition. Residents of the Dark World had to be extremely careful. Not only could a single mistake cost them their lives, but someone else could also benefit from their hard work. Hence, the Dark World had almost no ordinary players. Most would delete their accounts and try to start over in another world after spending just a few days in the other world. The players that chose to remain were either experts or particularly skilled at survival. When tens of millions of these players swarmed Cold Spring Forest, not even 5 superpowers working together could stop them all, much less a single superpower. Even if the various superpowers on the main continent banded together, they'd pay an unimaginable price to defeat the Dark World's denizens. Their losses might be severe enough to cause their eventual collapse. Shifeng, however, had just declared that Zero Wing could take control of the Dark World's portal. For a moment, Magic Flash and his party wondered if this swordsman had lost his mind. Did the man assume that he owned God's domain? Guild leader Black Flame, I don't mean to doubt you, but this matter does involve too many interests. I do not have the authority to agree to such a deal, Old Forest insisted. After taking in a deep breath, he continued, only my guild leader can preside over this matter. The most I can do is inform him of your offer. I cannot say whether or not he'll agree. That's right. Why don't we return and discuss this with our guild leaders for now? Later, we'll return with the results of those discussions, Magic Flash suggested, nodding in agreement. Inwardly, however, he had already decided that Shifeng was a lunatic. While the Dark Demon set might be valuable, obtaining fine gold set equipment wouldn't be an issue once their guilds began to negotiate alliances with the various superpowers. The only downside was that the various superpowers couldn't provide fine gold set equipment that players could use until level 120. However, it would be more than enough to raid team dungeons and grind for levels. Even as a lifestyle player, Melancholic Smile could tell that Magic Flash and Old Forest were making perfunctory promises, let alone Shifeng, whose 5 senses had already reached their limits. I understand. With so many interests involved, reaching a swift decision will be very difficult for your 2 guilds. Zero Wing isn't in a rush, so I have no problems waiting for you to relay the situation to your guild leaders, Shifeng calmly agreed. Please, rest assured, Guild Leader Black Flame. We'll inform our guild leaders upon our return, Old Forest said, nodding. Following which, Magic Frost and Old Forest each handed Shifeng their promised 250,000 darkness crystals before leaving the Freedom Hotel and making their way back to the Dark World. Once they left, Gentle Snow frowned. Guild Leader, now that the Dark World's portal has opened, should we restrict our guild members' range of activity? Gentle Snow asked. She hadn't expected the portal to open so quickly. Fortunately, Zero Wing had reached an agreement with Dark Rhapsody and Deity Society regarding the Darkness Crystal's delivery as soon as it did. Otherwise, Zero Wing wouldn't have known when the portal opened and would have lost its opportunity to prepare for battle. That won't be necessary. Since the Dark World's portal is open, we should visit this other world. Contact Fire's team and the Hell Legion and inform them to gather, Shifeng said, chuckling. Are we really going there? Shifeng's decision surprised her. When Shifeng had declared his intentions to Dark Rhapsody and Deity Society's representatives, she hadn't thought it was nonsense in the least. As long as Zero Wing had enough time, it was entirely possible. Not only did the guild now have the Freedom Hotel, but the guild as a whole also earned a daily net profit of more than 100,000 gold. Moreover, Zero Wing's coin and magic crystal income would continue to increase as Stone Forest City's player population did. With the Freedom Hotel to attract players, more expert players would flood into the city, as well. With so many advantages, growing until it ruled Cold Spring Forest with an iron fist was entirely possible. Now, however, including the Hell Legion, Zero Wing only had a little over 500 Tier 3 experts under its command. Even if they included the 600 or so Tier 3 knights, they weren't powerful enough to challenge the Dark World in its entirety. Mitchum. We're heading there now. If we don't hurry, it'll be too late, Shifeng stated, determination lacing his tone. All right. I'll notify Fire and the others, Gentle Snow answered. Although she didn't understand what Shifeng intended, they shouldn't have any problem surviving. Melancholic, how is the construction of the Crimson Dragon flying ships coming along? Shifeng asked, turning to the Candlelight's manager. Excluding the one in your possession, we have a total of 5 Crimson Dragon flying ships ready, Melancholic Smile proudly informed him. Although more players now had flying mounts of their own, 5 flying ships were more than enough for Zero Wing to rule the skies. Not one of God's domain's other powers could threaten the guild in the air. Good. Get them ready, Shifeng said, nodding. While Gentle Snow and Melancholic Smile saw to their preparations, Magic Flash and his team flew back to the Dark World's portal atop their darkness bats. Upon their return to their home Otherworld, they noticed the swarm of dark players and tents filling the gravel plain 1,000 yards ahead. There were easily millions of dark players in the camp. Every one of these dark players practically vibrated with darkness energy and bloodlust, and even the lowest leveled among them was level 105. Quite a few were also Tier 3 experts. We haven't been gone that long, yet so many more have already gathered. Magic Flash exclaimed, watching the massive crowd below. From what he could tell, at least 4 or 5 million players had set up in the camp. In comparison, the several tens of thousands of players Dark Rhapsody had dispatched were nothing. When Magic Flash thought back to Feng's arrogant claim, he couldn't help but view the man as even more of a fool. However, Magic Flash and Old Forest continued to carry out their duties and inform their higher-ups of Feng's proposal. Within a conference tent containing hundreds of players. Black Flame is insane. Now that the Dark World's portal has opened, he'll have a hard time just protecting himself, yet he has designs on our other world. When Blue Rainbow, the female Dark Knight from Dark Rhapsody, heard Magic Flash and Old Forest's report, she could not help but laugh. It's probably because he hasn't seen the gathered army yet. Once he does, like the various superpowers from earlier, he'll likely abandon the naive thought, Deity Society's Elder Gold replied, similarly smiling. A few superpowers, who had been informed of the portal's opening, had sent representatives to the Dark World not long ago. They had wanted to negotiate business deals with the other world's various powers, but when they saw the number of Dark players waiting for the impending invasion, the representatives had dropped their proposals. Those superpowers representatives had realized that the moment the gathered Dark players burst through the open portal, even the neighboring kingdoms and empires would be at risk, let alone Cold Spring Forest. In truth, even the Dark World's top 3 guilds had been surprised by how many players had joined the invading army. They had only estimated that around 20,000 experts would show up, yet more than 30,000 Tier 3 experts had already joined the camp. At this rate, they wouldn't have any problems gathering 40 or 50,000 Tier 3 experts by the time the invasion began. While Blue Rainbow and Elder Gold spoke in hushed whispers, the various representatives in the tent fell silent. Read latest chapters at Wuxia World. EU, it seems everyone is of the same opinion. In that case, there's no point in continuing this discussion. We can still afford to ignore Stone Forest City, but since the Dark World has mustered such a powerful army, we cannot let the main continent's superpowers take our share of the city. A cold, robust man resting in one of the 3 main seats within the tent spoke up. Standing, he continued, let us officially advance into Cold Spring Forest. It's time we show the main continent's powers the strength of our Dark World. As the robust man finished speaking, the various representatives ordered their subordinates to march on Cold Spring Forest. The several million players in the plain began to stomp toward the gigantic door before them, shocking the scouts the main continent's superpowers had sent. These scouts immediately contacted their superiors to inform them of the shocking scene. Meanwhile, in an advanced room on the Freedom Hotel's 29th floor. So, in the end, they're still invading. Yuan Tianxin shook his head and sighed when he read his subordinate's message. Chapter 2560, Darkness Invades. Zero Wing arrives shortly after Yuan Tianxin read his subordinate's message. The door to the quiet room opened. A group of players walked in behind a male half-elf covered in azure sparks. As the half-elf entered the room, all of the fire-type mana began to gather around him as if summoned. As a result, the room's temperature steadily rose. Shine. What are you doing here? Yuan Tianxin was surprised to see the male half-elf, Scorching Shire. There weren't many people in the secret pavilion that knew the name Scorching Shine, and those who did were generally members of the guild's older generations. While Scorching Shine's current appearance made him look as if he were in his 30s, he was actually over 50. The man had withdrawn from the secret pavilion's front lines many years ago and was only active behind the scenes. Before Scorching Shine had withdrawn, he had been considered one of the pavilion's absolute monsters. He could even contend with the commander of mythology's strongest trump card legion. He no longer busied himself with guild affairs, however, preferring to focus on his own improvement. Not even Yuan Tianxin, who had a close relationship with Scorching Shrine, could begin to imagine how powerful the man had become. However, Scorching Shrine's individual strength wasn't the reason he was so well known in the secret pavilion. Rather, it was the Scorched Legion under his command. The Scorched Legion was one of the secret pavilion's trump card legions, and Scorching Shrine had personally nurtured every one of its experts. Although the legion only had 200 members, they were all geniuses Scorching Shrine had handpicked from the pavilion's new recruits. Initially, the man had set his sights on Purple Jade, as well. Unfortunately, she preferred one-handed swords, and Scorching Shrine's knowledge of the combat style was limited. In the end, she hadn't joined his Scorched Legion. The Scorched Legion was still considered a hidden force, secretly fighting on God's domain's frontlines. It existed solely for exploring new maps and almost never meddled in guild affairs. Now, however, Scorching Shine and his legion had come to Stone Forest City, which left Yuan Tianxin a little confused. We received the command from Vice Guild Leader Dawn. Now that the Dark World's portal has opened, she specifically sent me to negotiate with the various superpowers targeting the city, Scorching Shine softly explained. Vice Guild Leader Dawn sent you to take charge of the situation. Hearing the news, Yuan Tianxin breathed a sigh of relief. This is good. With you here, I'm sure those superpowers will show restraint. In that case, Zero Wing might have a chance of fending off their combined assault. Yuan Tianxin had been worried that Dawn Jade had given up on Stone Forest City, but now that the Scorched Legion had arrived, the city had gained an additional layer of defense. The Scorched Legion was no weaker than Netherworld Empire's Hell Legion. In fact, in large-scale combat, the Scorched Legion would easily outperform the Hell Legion since none of its members were human. Aside from half-elves, which were particularly skilled with magic, the Legion had half-orc members, who were formidable melee fighters. Their combat power was leagues greater than human players of the same level and tier. Of course, the Secret Pavilion had paid a huge price to ensure that the Scorched Legion's members reached Tier 3 as quickly as possible. Don't get excited just yet. Stone Forest City's recent promotion has made the various superpowers even more desperate to obtain it. Even with my Legion here, we can't guarantee that Zero Wing will keep the right to rule Stone Forest City. However, if Zero Wing is willing to hand over some of the city's shares, I'm sure keeping the city under its control won't be a problem, Scorching Shine calmly stated. Let's not waste any more time. The Dark World's players are already marching on Cold Spring Forest. We need to prepare quickly. I'm not familiar with Black Flame, so you'll have to contact him. That won't be a problem. I'll inform Zero Wing right away, Yuan Tianxin agreed, nodding. He then contacted his connections in Zero Wing. The various superpowers' combined force wasn't the most worrisome, rather, the Dark World's forces warranted more concern. Not even the Secret Pavilion had expected the Dark World to be so powerful. The other world's invading army had more than 5 million experts, and more than 30,000 of them were Tier 3 experts. The army also had more than 50 flying mounts, and to make matters worse, these numbers only grew as time passed. If this army were allowed to flood into Cold Spring Forest, the consequences would be dire. Shortly after Yuan Tianxin contacted Zero Wing, however, he froze in shock. Old Yuan, has something happened with Zero Wing? Scorching Shine asked, his curiosity piqued when he noticed his old comrade's stunned expression. Not long ago, Black Flame led a team to the Dark World's portal. He plans to negotiate with the Dark World's players, Yuan Tianxin grimly explained. Negotiate with the Dark World's players? The news dazed Scorching Shrine, as well. He then looked at Yuan Tianxin and asked, are you sure Black Flame's brain is working properly? What a joke. With the portal to the Dark World open, the other world's players were like a pack of starving wolves that had just spotted fresh meat. They'd pounce on anyone they encountered, not wait for negotiations. This was precisely the reason that the various superpowers had ordered their members to stay at least 10,000 yards away from the portal, afraid that they'd lose their subordinates to these ravenous wolves. Shifeng, however, was doing the exact opposite. Instead of strengthening Stone Forest City's defenses, he had taken the initiative to contact the Dark World's players personally. He was heading straight for the portal, basically offering himself up, gift-wrapped, to the Dark World's army. Even the various superpowers were stunned when they learned of Shifeng's plan from their spies in Zero Wing. What was going on? Was Zero Wing about to surrender? Inside another advanced room within the Freedom Hotel. Illusory, it seems Zero Wing will fall, even without the various superpowers' interference, the fierce man from Crimson Emperor said as he read a report from his subordinate. Shaking his head, he continued, we won't even have to wait 2 or 3 days for this war to conclude. Everything will likely end today. This is insane. We're talking about an entire other world of experts. Why would he pull such a crazy stunt? Illusory Words couldn't believe her eyes when she read the report. When Shifeng had tried to challenge an entire city with only several hundred players, she had seen a possibility for him to succeed, but trying to repel all of the players from an otherworld was a fool's dream. This was no longer a force an individual power could hope to overcome. While Illusory Words and many others were puzzled by Shifeng's most recent ploy, Furious Heart, who had been busy persuading the Dark World's players to act, received the news. Interesting. It seems Black Flame really loves a fight. He must think this battle will be just like the one in Demon City. Furious Heart laughed as he read the report. Hopefully, he doesn't turn and flee after witnessing the Dark World's army. I wouldn't want this to be too boring. Elated, Furious Heart shifted his gaze to the invading army that marched through the portal into Cold Spring Forest. In the face of this army of several million dark players, even a kingdom would fall, much less Zero Wing. Following which, Furious Heart tossed aside the report and led his team through the portal. When the Dark World's players arrived in Cold Spring Forest, a commotion broke out among the army. So, this is the main continent? Crap. There are so many rare ores and herbs nearby. This place is ours for the taking. The dark players couldn't help their growing excitement as they drank in the beautiful scenery in Cold Spring Forest. They wanted nothing more than to claim the surrounding resource areas right away. Even the upper echelons from the other world's various powers looked around them with a passionate flame burning in their eyes. They had to admit that Cold Spring Forest was a much higher quality than the Dark World's level 100 maps. As long as they could collect these resources, neither their individual development nor their guilds would be a problem. Before the Dark World's residents could celebrate, however, they heard a loud roaring from the distance, a deep rumble that echoed throughout the valley the portal occupied. Read latest chapters at Wuxia World. Everyone turned toward the origin of the sound. The dark players then spotted 5 colossal figures flying toward them. As the roaring grew louder, they could begin to distinguish the flying giants' details. Are those flying ships? With a closer look and realizing what the monstrosities were, everyone was stunned. Those 5 flying ships were too massive. The largest flying mounts they had seen would be insignificant beside the steel giants. As the 5 flew in formation, they practically blotted out the sky. Chapter 2561, Zero Wings Foundations, Madness Time. Why are so many flying ships here? Did we trigger some kind of event, and NPCs have come to deal with us? The sudden appearance of the 5 flying ships stunned the dark players emerging from the gigantic door. They all began to talk about the incoming ships, anxious. Flying ships were no longer a foreign concept to God's Domain's players, but their familiarity was precisely the reason that the dark players were afraid of how powerful the machines were. Flying ships were powerful war weapons and absolute kings in the skies. One of those ships could effortlessly squash humans like ants. Current players, who sorely lacked aerial combat power, saw flying ships as unstoppable and destructive tools. With 5 flying ships approaching, why wouldn't these dark players worry? Wait, something's not right. There are players aboard the flying ships. A Tier 3 ranger, gifted with sharp vision, shouted as he pointed to the Crimson Dragon flying ships hovering above them. Nearly everyone's eyes narrowed as they tried to get a better look at the ships, and just as the Tier 3 ranger had announced, players stood on each of the flying ships' decks. While they were still too far off to get a clear view of the players, the green diamond markers were undoubtedly above the blurry figures' heads. Who are those people? They actually have flying ships. Could it be a super guild? Their curiosity piqued, the dark players wondered who piloted the incoming vessels. Flying ships were still far out of reach for the Dark World's residents. They barely had any flying mounts, after all, and yet, 5 player-owned flying ships were flying toward them right now. Even the upper echelons from the other world's various major powers were stunned. 5 flying ships. Who are these people? What are they trying to accomplish? 1 or 2 flying ships might not be a major problem, but 5 was a little too much. None of them wanted to face such a force in battle. If it did come down to a fight, the outcome wouldn't be in their favor, even if they eventually won. While the Dark World's powers discussed the situation in hushed tones, the 5 ships descended, stopping roughly 100 yards above ground. A figure then jumped from one of the ship's decks, landing in the center of the Dark players' army. The players on the ground unconsciously stepped back, quickly clearing the way for the figure to land unhindered. As the figure landed, the various powers' upper echelons stared with wide, shocked eyes, particularly Magic Flash and Old Forest, who had just returned from their trip to Stone Forest City. The individual who had jumped from one of the flying ships was none other than Zero Wings Guild leader, Black Flame. It's him. Impossible. When Magic Flash and Old Forest saw Shifeng's familiar face, they couldn't believe their eyes. Any power capable of owning 5 flying ships had to be a superpower with heaven-defying strength in their opinions, and yet, the reality was that Zero Wing, a guild at risk of obliteration, was responsible for this display. How could they possibly believe this? Sure enough, it is Zero Wing, Blue Rainbow thought, standing behind Magic Flash. Unlike the 2 representatives, she didn't seem all that surprised to see Shifeng. Is this why he is so confident? The Dark World's general populace considered flying ships to be out of players' reach, but when Dark Rhapsody had investigated Zero Wing's background, it had discovered that the guild owned multiple ships. This was why Shifeng had failed to surprise her. Of course, she wasn't entirely unfazed. She was a little shocked to discover that Zero Wing had as many as 5 fling ships. It was a few more than her guild's reports had stated. When Furious Heart saw this, his lips formed a tight frown. Intense rage and fear flashed in his eyes as he watched Shifeng. How is this possible? How does Zero Wing have so many flying ships? Furious Heart's eyes were bloodshot as he stared at the steel giants in the air. His guild had already been concerned when they received the report mentioning 3 flying ships in Zero Wing's possession. Now that he knew the guild had 2 more than that, Stone Forest City would be much more difficult to deal with. As the Dark World's major powers recognized Shifeng and were astonished over his guild's foundations, an indifferent, robust man emerged from the crowd. The instant he stepped forward, he attracted all of the major powers' attention, and everyone watched him with respectful gazes. This robust man was Dawn Dominance, World Domination's guild leader. He was a legend in the Dark World. Not only had he single-handedly developed world domination to become one of the other world's top 3 guilds, but he was also one of the Dark World's top-ranked experts. Dawn Dominance was precisely why Dark Rhapsody and Deity Society were so afraid of the up-and-coming world domination. He had even been chosen to preside over the earlier war conference. You must be Zero Wing's guild leader, Black Flame, Dawn Dominance addressed Shifeng. I am Dawn Dominance, World Domination's guild leader. You could say that I'm one of the leaders for the Dark World's invasion into Cold Spring Forest. May I know the reason for your sudden visit, guild leader Black Flame? You're correct. I am Black Flame, and I've come to inform your Dark World players of something, Shifeng said, nodding. If you wish to persuade us to abandon our conquest of this map, forget about it. The matter was decided the moment the portal opened, Dawn Dominance said. Cold Spring Forest's resources are important to both of us, of which you are well aware, guild leader Black Flame. Of course, we also do not wish to antagonize Zero Wing intentionally, but we can only rely on our own strength to get what we need. I hope you understand, guild leader Black Flame. As Dawn Dominance finished speaking, the countless dark players in earshot nodded in agreement. Why should only the main continent's players benefit from Cold Spring Forest's resources? If one wished to acquire leveling resources, they could do so with their own power. Read latest chapters at Wuxia World. EU. Does Black Flame really think he can scare away so many dark players with just 5 flying ships? How naive. Furious Heart laughed softly as he watched Shifeng's distant figure. 5 flying ships was an amazingly powerful force, but if Shifeng thought he could stop several million experts from the Dark World with just this, he was a fool. Moreover, the Dark World's invasion army had over 50 flying mounts. Challenging those flying ships was entirely possible. Besides, the various powers present all had their own trump cards, which they could unleash on the steel giants. As Furious Heart's laughter died, however, Sherfong glanced around at the chuckling dark players and shook his head. Guild leader Dawn, I believe you've misunderstood something. I never had any intention of negotiation with any of you. I am only here to tell you one thing. Sherfong said. From this moment on, this teleportation gate is under Zero Wing's control. Chapter 2562, Challenging the Dark World. Silence fell as Sherfong finished his declaration. Magic Flash and Old Forest stared at the swordsman with their mouths ajar. They hadn't actually thought he'd been serious. This was insane. They had assumed Sherfong had been joking back in the Freedom Hotel, and yet, the man had just repeated his intentions straight to the Dark World's various powers and independent players. After a moment, every dark player broke out in riotous laughter. Did this guy come all this way just to tell us a joke? He actually thinks Zero Wing will manage this teleportation gate from now on. Does he really think he can claim ownership by declaring it? Who does this guy think he is? For a time, the countless dark players expressed their anger and ridicule. Their prior fear and awe had evaporated like fog on a hot day. They wondered how hard Sherfong had hit his head to provoke the dark world in its entirety so boldly. What is Black Flame trying to do? Did he give himself a concussion and lose his mind? Doesn't he realize that he basically just declared war on everyone in the dark world? Blue Rainbow frowned at Sherfong, who still seemed quite calm. When they had heard Magic Flash and Old Forest's report, they had considered Sherfeng's intentions a joke. Now, however, Sherfong had publicly announced Zero Wing's plan to take control of the teleportation gate. If this was a joke, it wasn't funny. As far as she was concerned, this swordsman either overestimated himself or was on a path of self-destruction. Not even multiple cooperating super guilds would dare spout such nonsense before the Dark World's army, much less a single superpower. Anyone that took control of the teleportation gate would reign over the Dark World. This was beyond foolish. He's dead. He's definitely dead now. Furious Heart laughed maniacally as he watched Sherfong. Thanks to Sherfeng's announcement, the Dark World's various powers and independent experts would stop at nothing to obliterate Zero Wing, even if Demon's Heart didn't pull any strings. They likely wouldn't let the matter rest until they had removed any trace of Zero Wing from Cold Spring Forest. If they didn't, the main continent's players would look down on them, which was something the Dark World's denizens and powers wouldn't allow. Once the Dark World's collective laughter died down, each of these dark players turned lethal gazes on Sherfong, killing intent radiating from them in waves. Some Tier 3 experts even unsheathed their weapons, preparing to teach this arrogant swordsman a lesson. What a pity, Guild Leader Black Flame. I had hoped you were smart enough to know when to advance and when to retreat, but it would seem that Dark Rhapsody and Deity Society had thought too highly of you, Dawn Dominance said, shaking his head. He then turned to leave, with no intention of continuing his conversation with Sherfong. A unit of 5 flying ships might be impressive, but it wasn't intimidating enough to force the Dark World's invading army to back down. While war weapons had frightening power and deadly potential, their attack rates were very low. When there wasn't much of a difference between two sides' combat power, an additional 5 flying ships would prove miraculously effective, but if one side had an overwhelming combat power advantage, the ships couldn't turn the tide of battle. At Tier 3, expert players were more than agile enough to evade flying ships' attacks as long as there was enough distance between them. Furthermore, the invading army had more than 50 flying mounts, just as much aerial combat power as Zero Wing. When Dawn Dominance left, the surrounding Tier 3 experts smirked and moved to surround Sherfong. Nearly 1,000 Tier 3 experts pointed their weapons at the swordsman, their combined killing intent so powerful that the air around them grew cold and cloudy. The Tier 2 dark players that had come to Cold Spring Forest to join the fun couldn't contain their excitement as they watched. Not even superpowers had so many Tier 3 experts, yet the Dark World's army had so many more. When less than 50 yards separated these dark experts and Sherfong, figures began to drop from the hovering flying ships, one after another. In the blink of an eye, nearly 500 Tier 3 experts took their places around Sherfong, and every one of them radiated a more intense aura than the Dark World's Tier 3 experts. Seeing reinforcements arrive, the encroaching dark players came to a halt. The various major powers spectating upper echelons were similarly astonished. They had never dreamed that Zero Wing could muster such strength. Now that 500 Tier 3 experts had joined the fray, the Dark World's top 3 guilds would be no match for Zero Wing's force, even if they worked together. Including the flying ships still looming above them, engaging in battle now would only invite Zero Wing to slaughter those top 3 guilds. It's no wonder why you dared to spout such nonsense. Zero Wing is actually quite formidable. Dawn Dominance had stopped, turning to glance at the Tier 3 experts around Shifeng, but he shook his head and continued, however, I'm afraid that still won't be enough to defeat the Dark World. As he finished speaking, more Tier 3 dark players swarmed around Shifeng. In less than 30 seconds, a group of over 6,000 Tier 3 dark players had joined the encirclement. Even Blue Frost and his Zero Wing companions from Shelter 1, all of whom had participated in numerous battles, couldn't help but frown. Blue, what do you think the guild leader is trying to do? We're not really going to fight against all those people, are we? Best Reincarnation, the leader of Shelter 1's second party, nervously asked. He had watched and fought in multiple wars involving tens of thousands of players, but compared to the Dark World's army, those forces weren't worth mentioning. Not even an army of tens of thousands would be a warm-up for these 6,000 plus Tier 3 experts. If this force entered the Dark Den, they could sweep through the other world without any trouble. Even if every shelter banded together, they wouldn't survive. Meanwhile, Zero Wing had fewer than 500 Tier 3 experts present, and even with monsters like Fire Dance and Hell Rush, their chances of victory were unknown. I don't know, but even if we lose this battle, it'll be helpful in the future. Not just anyone gets an opportunity to face such a powerful force, Blue Frost replied with a bitter smile. He had to admit that while Shifeng's behavior was insane, his blood boiled with excitement. After all, who, at this stage of the game, would dare challenge such a formidable army? Even the main continent's various superpowers were afraid of the Dark World's invading army, but not Zero Wing. If they lost, they'd lose with their pride intact. This was also a super rare opportunity to clash with a large number of Tier 3 experts, and the experience would definitely bolster their future development. Read latest chapters at Wuxia World. EU. As soon as Blue Frost finished his reply, however, Shifeng stepped forward from Zero Wing's defensive circle and faced the Dark World's several thousand Tier 3 experts directly. It seems you still don't understand, Shifeng said, shaking his head at the Tier 3 dark players around him. Calmly, he continued, since the very beginning, I told you that I've only come to inform you. I'm not here to negotiate. Since you wish to test my patience, I regret to inform you that you've picked a fight with the wrong person. Shifeng then pulled a token from his bag and started to chant an incantation. It was simple, only consisting of a dozen or so syllables, and would even be easy for a player new to God's domain to chant. Before the dark players could mock Shifeng for his ignorant foolishness, several magic arrays quickly manifested behind the swordsman. In less than a second, they transformed into a spatial gate, and once the gate was complete, NPCs in exquisite, uniform equipment marched into Cold Spring Forest like a well-trained army. Every one of these NPCs had at least reached level 120 and Tier 3. Many of them even hailed from other races, and in the blink of an eye, more than 1,000 NPCs had joined the battlefield.